Hello. Tonight, you step into the silent, echoing corridors of a fortress, witnessing its final administrative sunset, traversing the melancholic path of a civilization that is slowly, quietly, and irrevocably fading into the archives of history, leaving behind only stone, shadow, and detailed inventories. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. The morning of the 2nd of January in the year 1492 broke with a pale, indifferent light over the snow-capped peaks of the mountains that border the southern plateau, casting long, sharp shadows across the red clay fortifications that had served as the seat of administrative and military power for over 2 centuries. It was a day characterized not by the chaotic noise of a siege or the frantic clashes of steel associated with medieval warfare, but by a profound and heavy stillness that seemed to settle over the valley like a dense physical weight, muffling the footsteps of horses and the hushed, anxious whispers of the gathered crowds. The air was crisp, biting with the dry chill of the high altitude, and it carried the faint, lingering scent of pine and damp earth, providing a sensory backdrop to an event that marked the definitive legal and political conclusion of an entity that had defined the peninsula for nearly 800 years. On this specific day, the keys to the city, heavy iron symbols of sovereignty and municipal control, were formally transferred from the hands of the last ruler of the ruling dynasty to the representatives of the northern monarchs, an act that was performed with a rigid solemnity befitting the gravity of the historical rupture it represented. The procession that wound its way down from the fortified palace complex was somber, a slow-moving river of silk and steel descending from the architectural heights towards the banks of the river below, where the final diplomatic exchange was to take place. There were no cheers of triumph that could drown out the palpable sense of uncertainty felt by those who were departing. Nor was there an immediate occupation of the urban center, for the transition had been orchestrated through months of secret negotiations and diplomatic correspondence to ensure an orderly transfer of administrative power. The city itself, a complex labyrinth of winding streets, whitewashed residential quarters, and verdant internal gardens, held its breath as the banners of the new administration were hoisted upon the highest watchtower of the fortress, the stone sentinel that overlooked the sprawling urban expanse below. The raising of these flags, emblazoned with the heraldic symbols of the northern kingdoms and the religious iconography of the conquerors, signaled to the inhabitants of the lower city districts that the legal and religious order they had known for generations had been formally superseded by a new authority. It is recorded in the chronicles of the time that the deposed ruler, upon leaving the city that had been the seat of his ancestors, paused at a mountain pass to look back one last time at the urban sprawl of the capital, a moment of personal grief that has been preserved in the historical record, but which marked the beginning of a long and arduous exile across the sea. The landscape he viewed was one of cultivated terraces, intricate irrigation systems, and extensive orchards of pomegranate and citrus, a testament to the agricultural and engineering prowess that had flourished under the dominion of his forebears. This agricultural legacy, deeply rooted in the management of soil and water, would remain long after the political administration had changed, a persistent echo of the civilization that was now retreating or dissolving into the new social fabric of the conquest. As the day wore on, the victorious troops entered the city in a disciplined formation, their armor glinting in the winter sun, marching through gates that had previously been barred to them, passing under arches inscribed with verses of praise to a different conception of the divine, inscriptions that were now to be viewed by eyes that did not understand the script or the cultural context. The atmosphere within the city walls was one of apprehension and suspended animation, as the population, now subjects of a different crown, retreated behind the heavy wooden doors of their homes, awaiting the implementation of the terms that had been agreed upon in the capitulations. The religious sanctuaries, with their slender towers piercing the skyline, stood silent, the call to prayer suspended in a moment of ambiguous transition, while the bells of the improvised chapels began to toll, marking a new auditory rhythm to the life of the city. The transition was not merely military or political, but spatial and sensory. The very sounds and smells of the public spaces began to shift as the new occupiers established their garrisons and administrative centers within the palaces and public buildings of the conquered capital. The intricate plasterwork of the royal chambers, with its geometric patterns and calligraphic friezes, looked down upon a court that spoke a different language and wore different attire, creating a stark visual contrast between the architectural container and the new inhabitants, a dissonance that would take decades to resolve or erase in the days and weeks that followed this ceremonial surrender. The reality of the occupation began to set in, manifesting in the establishment of a new bureaucracy designed to integrate this vast and wealthy territory into the legal framework of the northern state. Royal secretaries and scribes, armed with quills and parchment, began the laborious task of inventorying the assets of the crown, recording the properties, the lands, and the revenues that were now under the jurisdiction of the new monarchs. This bureaucratic process was slow, methodical, and devoid of emotion, reducing the vibrant life of the city to lists of taxable entities and strategic locations, transforming a living culture into a series of administrative data points. The streets, once filled with the bustling trade of silk and spices, saw the introduction of new regulations and market overseers, as the economic life of the region was realigned to serve the interests of the northern markets and the royal treasury. The silence that had marked the day of surrender gradually gave way to the low, persistent hum of administrative restructuring, a sound less dramatic than war, but far more enduring in its capacity to reshape the identity of a place. The winter of 1492 turned into spring, and the almond trees blossomed as they had for centuries, indifferent to the flag that flew above the fortress. Yet the people who tended them lived in a world that had been fundamentally altered, navigating a precarious existence between the memory of the past and the uncertain dictates of the new order. This period of immediate aftermath was characterized by a strange duality. On the surface, the physical structures of the city remained largely intact. The baths continued to function, and the markets opened their stalls, yet the underlying social contract had been rewritten. The nobility of the former regime began to liquidate their assets or prepare for departure, selling their estates to the incoming aristocracy or to the crown, initiating a transfer of wealth that would permanently alter the demographic and economic landscape of the region. The departure of the elite left the ordinary citizens, the artisans, farmers, and laborers, without their traditional patrons and protectors, exposing them to the direct authority of the new governors and the ecclesiastical hierarchy that was swiftly establishing itself. The psychological weight of this abandonment was profound, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability among the remaining population, who watched as the ships departed from the coast, carrying away the remnants of the court and the cultural patronage that had made the city a center of art and learning. The city, now a frontier outpost of a strictly unified kingdom, began its slow metamorphosis, a process of accretion and erosion where the new was built upon the old, sometimes incorporating it, sometimes obliterating it, but always changing its fundamental nature. The surrender was an event in time, a specific date in a chronicle, but the end of the civilization was a process of duration, a slow extinguishing of a flame that flickered in the private spaces of homes and hearts. Long after the public institutions had been dismantled, this slow fade was governed not by the sword, but by the pen, specifically through a document that had been drafted and signed weeks before the first soldier set foot inside the city gates. The instrument that governed this profound transition, and which theoretically secured the rights and safety of the conquered population, was a document known as the Treaty of Capitulation, signed and ratified in late November of the year 1491, mere weeks before the physical entry into the city. This legal text, composed of 69 specific articles, stands as a testament to the diplomatic complexity of the surrender and the pragmatic approach initially adopted by the conquerors to ensure a peaceful transfer of such a populous and fortified region. The document was written on parchment, sealed with the heavy wax seals of the monarchs, and its language was one of protection, assurance, and continuity, promising a degree of religious and social autonomy that was remarkably tolerant for the standards of the era. It was a bilateral agreement, negotiated between the ministers of the Sultan and the secretaries of the Christian kings, and it detailed with meticulous precision the conditions under which the subjects, now classified under a new legal status, would live under their new sovereigns. The text of the treaty explicitly guaranteed that the inhabitants of the region would be permitted to retain their religion, their places of worship, and their traditional calls to prayer. A concession that was intended to prevent a desperate last stand by the populace, which could have resulted in a prolonged and ruinous siege that would have damaged the prize the monarchs sought to possess. Furthermore, it stipulated that they would be judged by their own laws and magistrates in matters of civil dispute, preserving a parallel legal system that maintained the internal cohesion of the community even as political sovereignty had shifted to a new capital. The clauses of the treaty extended beyond the spiritual to the material, addressing the anxieties of the wealthy and the merchant classes by securing their property rights and their freedom of movement within the kingdom and across the sea. It was agreed that no soldier or official of the new administration would be allowed to enter the home of a subject without permission, nor would they be permitted to insult or molest the new subjects, provisions that suggest a keen awareness of the potential for friction and abuse in the aftermath of the conquest. The document also addressed the issue of taxation, stating that the inhabitants would only be liable for the taxes they had traditionally paid to their own rulers, preventing the imposition of arbitrary or punitive levies by the new administration. This fiscal continuity was designed to keep the local economy functioning and to ensure that the crown could immediately begin to draw revenue from the silk trade and agriculture without causing economic collapse or rebellion. Additionally, the treaty contained provisions for those who wished to emigrate, obliging the crown to provide safe passage and ships to transport them to the northern coast of Africa, a clause that facilitated the voluntary exile of the irreconcilable elements of the elite while encouraging the productive classes to remain and work the land. The language of the capitulations was solemn and binding, invoking the names of the divine and swearing by the royal honor of the monarchs to uphold these privileges forever, a word that would be tested by the passage of time and the changing political climate of the court. Reading the archival transcripts of these capitulations today reveals a snapshot of a society in a state of carefully managed suspension, where the structures of the past were preserved in amber, even as the context around them changed completely. The text goes into specific detail regarding the preservation of the Arabic language, allowing its use in public and private life, and ensuring that interpreters would be available for interactions with the new authorities. It also protected the existing endowments of the charitable foundations, the properties which supported schools, hospitals, and the poor, thereby maintaining the social safety net of the community. There were clauses that specifically forbade the forced conversion of the population to the faith of the conquerors, a practice that was common in other contexts of medieval warfare, but was here explicitly prescribed in the interest of stability and order. The treaty even addressed the sensitive issue of renegades and converts, attempting to regulate the movement between religious identities in a way that minimized conflict and public disorder. It was, in essence, a blueprint for a pluralistic society under a unified rule, a continuation of a social model that had existed in other parts of the peninsula for centuries, but applied here to a concentrated and culturally distinct population that had only just lost its independence. However, the existence of the document and the reality of its implementation were separated by the friction of daily governance and the ideological shifts of the conquering power, while the ink on the parchment promised perpetuity. The administrative reality was one of gradual erosion and reinterpretation, as the new governors appointed to the city began to find the autonomy of the population to be an obstacle to the complete integration of the territory. The capitulations served as a dampener to the immediate shock of conquest, a psychological cushion that allowed the surrender to take place without the total destruction of the urban infrastructure. But they also set the stage for a prolonged legal and social struggle. The conquered population clung to the text of the treaty as a guarantee of their survival, citing its articles and petitions and lawsuits. When their rights were infringed upon by overzealous officials or new settlers arriving from the north, the archives are filled with the dust of these legal battles. Dry records of complaints about seized property, silenced towers, and increased tax burdens, all of which reference the original agreement signed in the winter of 1491. The meticulous nature of the treaty, with its 69 articles covering everything from the right to bear arms excluding firearms to the right to slaughter animals according to ritual custom, indicates that both sides understood the totality of the lifestyle that was at stake. The acceptance of these terms by the monarchs was likely a pragmatic calculation, a means to secure the city without destroying it in the process. But it created a complex legal anomaly within a kingdom that was increasingly moving towards religious and administrative uniformity. The tension between the written word of the capitulations and the unwritten imperatives of the ideology that had fueled the war would become the defining dynamic of the subsequent decade. The document created a protected status for the inhabitants that was distinct from that of others, giving them a false sense of security that their way of life could continue indefinitely under a new flag. It preserved the shell of the civilization, its laws, its customs, its language, while removing the political power that had sustained it, creating a fragile ecosystem that was vulnerable to any shift in royal policy or ecclesiastical pressure. As the years passed, the capitulations would be viewed less as a binding treaty between sovereigns and more as a revocable grant of privileges to a subject population, a subtle but decisive shift in legal interpretation that would have catastrophic consequences for the legacy of the civilization. The silence of the first years was thus not a silence of peace, but a silence of waiting, as the permanence of the parchment was slowly tested against the fluid and often ruthless nature of political power. The implementation of the new order began not with the sword, but with the establishment of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that was intended to oversee the spiritual transformation of the territory, a process that was initially conceived as a gradual and persuasive integration, rather than an abrupt cultural eradication. The appointment of the first Archbishop of Granada, a man of the Hieronymite order known for his austere piety and intellectual rigor, signaled the crown's initial intention to adhere to the spirit, if not always the letter, of the capitulations signed in the year 1491. This prelate, who had served as a confessor to the Queen, advocated for a method of conversion based on instruction, example, and the use of the vernacular language, rejecting the immediate use of force or the imposition of the Latin rite upon a population that possessed no understanding of Christian theology or liturgy. Under his guidance, the Church adopted a strategy of accommodation, encouraging the clergy to learn the Arabic language and to respect certain cultural customs of the conquered population that were deemed not to be directly contradictory to the essential dogmas of the faith. This period, which lasted for approximately 7 years following the surrender, represents a unique interlude in the history of the region, a time when the call to prayer from the minarets still mingled with the ringing of bells from the newly consecrated cathedrals, creating a dissonant but coexisting auditory landscape. In the valleys of the Alpujarras and the streets of the Albaysan, while the spiritual administration pursued this policy of soft assimilation, The civil and material administration of the city was undergoing a rigorous and documented transformation through a process known as the repartimiento, the distribution of properties and assets to the new settlers arriving from the north. The archives preserve the extensive registers, known as the Libros de Registro, which serve as a detailed cadastral survey of the city in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, listing the names of the streets, the dimensions of the houses, and the identities of the original Muslim owners, alongside the names of the Christian settlers who were granted these properties. These heavy-bound volumes reveal the systematic nature of the colonization, as thousands of old Christians, a legal designation used to distinguish those of unblemished lineage from the growing population of converts, moved south to claim the rewards of the war. The arrival of these settlers introduced a new demographic friction into the urban fabric, as they occupied the houses of the exiled nobility or were granted vacant properties in the heart of the Medina, altering the social composition of neighborhoods that had been homogeneous for centuries. The interactions between these new neighbors were regulated by a complex web of municipal ordinances that attempted to manage the inevitable disputes over water rights, party walls, and the use of public spaces. Disputes that were frequently adjudicated in the newly established Chancery Court. The physical transformation of the city during this phase was subtle but persistent, marked by the conversion of the principal mosques into churches, a process that often involved little more than the purification of the space with holy water. The installation of an altar and the removal of the minbar, the great mosque of Granada, a symbol of the religious authority of the Nasrid dynasty, was consecrated as the Cathedral of Santa Maria of the Incarnation. Yet the structure itself remained largely unchanged in these early years, retaining its rows of columns and its orientation towards the southeast. This architectural appropriation was a statement of dominance, but the retention of the original forms also reflected a pragmatic recognition of the beauty and utility of the existing buildings, as well as a lack of immediate funds to embark on massive new construction projects. Within the domestic sphere, the repartimiento records indicate that many Christian settlers adapted to the Andalusian style of living, inhabiting the introverted courtyard houses with their central fountains and gardens, although they often modified the interiors to suit their own social habits, such as the introduction of raised furniture and the alteration of the kitchen spaces to accommodate different dietary practices. The flow of water, governed by the ancient and complex regulations of the Tribunal of Waters, remained the lifeblood of the city, and the new administration was careful to maintain the specialized knowledge required to manage the labyrinthine system of cisterns, pipes, and channels that kept the city green and viable. However, the coexistence was underlined by a persistent economic and legal inequality that slowly eroded the status of the indigenous population. The crown, in need of revenue to fund its foreign wars and to maintain the court, began to impose a series of fiscal measures that fell disproportionately on the Muslim subjects, who were known as muddayars during this phase of their history. While the capitulations had promised that taxes would remain at the level paid to the former sultans, the interpretation of what constituted traditional taxes was elastic, and new levies were introduced on the production of silk, the sale of goods in the markets, and the ownership of land. The muddayar community, finding their economic margins squeezed, began to retreat from the commercial center of the city, moving towards the upper slopes of the Albasan or into the rural hinterlands, leaving the prime commercial real estate in the hands of the Genoese, Castilian, and Flemish merchants who followed the royal court. This spatial segregation was not yet mandated by law, but it was driven by the economic realities of the occupation and the increasing social pressure exerted by a settler population that viewed the Muslims with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The legal protections of the treaty were technically in force, but the machinery of the state moved inexorably towards a homogenization that viewed the presence of a distinct religious and cultural community as a weakness in the body politic. The educational initiatives of the archbishop, while well began to falter against the deep-seated resistance of a population that viewed conversion not as a spiritual enlightenment, but as a betrayal of their ancestors and a surrender of their identity. The Arabic language remained the primary vehicle of communication, commerce, and culture for the vast majority of the inhabitants, and the few who did accept baptism were often viewed with hostility by their own community and with skepticism by the Christians. The Alches, or renegades Christians, who had converted to Islam before the conquest and now sought to return to the fold, occupied a particularly precarious position, serving as intermediaries and translators but trusted by neither side. The slow pace of the conversion process began to generate impatience within the royal court, which was increasingly influenced by the rigorous and militant piety that was sweeping through Europe at the turn of the century. The dual nature of the administration, a lenient church hierarchy, clashing with a rapacious civil bureaucracy, a volatile environment where the slightest spark could ignite a conflict that would shatter the uneasy peace. By the end of the 15th century, the stage was set for a dramatic shift in policy, driven by the realization that the gradualist approach had failed to produce the unified Christian kingdom that the monarchs envisioned, leading to a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Andalusian legacy. The arrival of the royal court in the city in the year 1499 marked the end of the period of relative tolerance and the beginning of a systematic dismantling of the cultural and religious guarantees enshrined in the capitulations. The monarchs were accompanied by the powerful and uncompromising figure of the Archbishop of Toledo, a man of immense political influence and iron will, who viewed the persistence of Islamic practices in Granada not merely as a spiritual failure, but as a direct affront to the divine favor that had granted the victory. Upon reviewing the state of the diocese, he expressed profound dissatisfaction with the gentle methods of the local archbishop, arguing that 7 years of persuasion had yielded negligible results, and that the honor of the faith required a more robust and decisive approach. With the tacit approval of the monarchs, who departed for Seville, leaving him with broad powers to accelerate the integration of the territory, he initiated a program that bypassed the previous strategy of accommodation in favor of direct pressure and mass action. The atmosphere in the city shifted almost overnight from one of uneasy coexistence to one of palpable fear, as the agents of the new policy began to target the elites of the Muslim community, offering them a stark choice between conversion and the loss of their status and privileges. This shift in methodology was not merely a change in personnel. It represented the ascendancy of a new political ideology that equated religious uniformity with political loyalty, a doctrine that would come to define the governance of the Spanish Empire for centuries to come. The defining event of this new phase, and one of the most significant moments in the erasure of the Andalusian intellectual legacy, took place in the public square of Barrambla, the commercial heart of the city. In a calculated display of power designed to sever the population's link to their cultural heritage, the Archbishop of Toledo ordered the collection of thousands of books and manuscripts from the private libraries and public collections of Granada. These volumes, which included works of theology, philosophy, poetry, and history, represented the accumulated knowledge of centuries of Andalusian scholarship, a tradition that had preserved and expanded upon the classical learning of antiquity. On a day in late 1499, vast piles of these leather-bound manuscripts, with their intricate calligraphy and illuminated margins, were heaped in the center of the square and set alight in a massive public auto-da-f. The smoke from the burning parchment filled the air of the city, a visual and olfactory declaration that the era of the capitulations was over, and that the culture that had produced these works was now considered illicit. It is recorded by contemporary chroniclers that the Archbishop, in a singular concession to utility over ideology, ordered that books on medicine, and perhaps some on astronomy, be spared from the flames and transferred to the library of the university he was founding in Alcala. A pragmatic decision that preserved a fraction of the scientific knowledge while destroying the cultural and religious context that had produced it. This act of cultural violence was accompanied by a campaign of mass baptisms that technically violated the article of the treaty forbidding forced conversion. To circumvent the legal restrictions, the authorities employed a combination of bribery, intimidation, and the legal fiction that the conversions were voluntary. Entire neighborhoods were herded into squares, where they were sprinkled with holy water in groups, receiving Christian names and, theoretically, the obligations of Christian subjects without any prior instruction or catechism. These new Christians, who would later be known as Moriscos, found themselves in a legal limbo by accepting baptism, however coerced. They fell under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition and the canon law of the Church, stripping them of the protections of the Mudéjar status. The rapid increase in the number of nominal converts allowed the administration to claim a miraculous success, reporting to the Pope that the entire city had embraced the faith, a falsehood that masked the deep resentment and confusion that now permeated the society. The traditional leadership of the community, the faquis and community elders, were either co-opted, imprisoned, or forced into silence, leaving the population leaderless and disoriented in the face of this aggressive assault on their identity. The tension generated by these policies finally erupted in the district of the Albaycin, the densely populated quarter on the hill opposite the Alhambra, which had become a refuge for those resisting the new measures. The trigger was a relatively minor incident involving the arrest of a woman who was a renegade, which escalated into a riot and the killing of a constable, an act of defiance that the authorities had been anticipating and perhaps provoking. This uprising in the Albaycin, although quickly contained through negotiation and the personal intervention of the mild-mannered first archbishop, who walked unarmed into the rebellious quarter, provided the hardline faction with the legal pretext they required to annul the Treaty of Granada completely. They argued that by taking up arms against the royal officers, the Muslim population had broken their oath of allegiance and forfeited all rights granted by the capitulations. This legalistic interpretation transformed the status of the entire population from protected subjects with treaty rights to rebels, who could be offered a binary choice: unconditional conversion or expulsion. The revolt in the city was suppressed, but the unrest spread to the rugged mountains of the Alpujarras, where the rural population, less amenable to control and protected by the difficult terrain, launched a desperate insurgency that would require a full-scale military campaign to suppress the aftermath of the uprising, and the subsequent decree of 1501, which ordered the conversion or expulsion of all Muslims in the Kingdom of Granada, marked the official legal end of the Mudéjar presence in the region. The legacy of 800 years was no longer a living civilization protected by treaty, but a clandestine undercurrent maintained by a population of new Christians, who were legally indistinguishable from their neighbors, but culturally and religiously distinct. The destruction of the books at Bibrambla was a harbinger of the century of silence that was to follow, where the transmission of culture would move from the library and the mosque to the private sphere of the home and the oral tradition. The administrative machinery of the state now turned its attention to the surveillance of these new subjects, tasked with detecting the persistence of prohibited customs in a population that had been baptized en masse but remained unconverted in heart. The illusion of a unified Christian society had been created by decree, but the reality was a fractured community where the legacy of the past was driven underground, preserved in secret, behind closed doors, and in the memories of those who had witnessed the smoke rising from the square of Bib-Rambla. The dawn of the 16th century in Granada brought with it a profound transformation in the legal and social definition of the inhabitant, a shift that moved the primary site of conflict from the battlefield and the public square into the private and intimate spaces of the home. Following the decree of conversion, the category of Muslim legally ceased to exist within the boundaries of the kingdom, replaced by the designation of New Christian, or a term that carried within it a permanent suspicion of insincerity and a mark of social inferiority. To monitor this new and theoretically assimilated population, the machinery of the state required an instrument of investigation that could penetrate the facade of conformity, leading to the permanent establishment of the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition within the city. This institution, which had previously operated with devastating efficiency in Seville and Córdoba, requisitioned a confiscated palace in the lower city to serve as its headquarters, creating a bureaucratic center for the collection of information, the adjudication of heresy, and the management of confiscated assets. The arrival of the inquisitors brought a new rhythm to the administrative life of the city, characterized by the promulgation of edicts of faith, lengthy documents read aloud in the parish churches, which provided a detailed taxonomy of prohibited customs and behaviors, effectively weaponizing the daily habits of the culture against itself. The Edict of Faith served as a manual for the surveillance of the domestic sphere, instructing the old Christian population and the neighbors of the converts on how to identify the signs of crypto-Islam, or what was termed the sect of Muhammad. The list of incriminating signs was exhaustive and focused on the mundane rituals of hygiene, diet, and social celebration that constituted the fabric of Andalusian life. To wear a clean shirt on a Friday, to cook meat with oil instead of lard, to abstain from pork or wine, to face the southeast while praying, or to wash the limbs in a specific order before a meal, were all codified as acts of heresy that could lead to arrest and the sequestration of property. This criminalization of culture forced the Morisco population into a state of permanent vigilance, where the walls of the courtyard house, traditionally a sanctuary of privacy, became porous to the eyes and ears of servants, neighbors, and informers. The archives of the tribunal are filled with the testimonies of witnesses who reported the absence of smoke from chimneys on Saturdays, suggesting the observance of the Sabbath, or the muffled sounds of water being poured in the dead of night, suggesting ritual ablution. The burden of proof lay upon the accused to demonstrate the purity of their faith, a task that was often impossible in a system where the accuser remained anonymous and the cultural markers of the past were interpreted as evidence of theological dissent. In response to this invasive scrutiny, the Morisco community developed a complex psychological and theological strategy of survival known as taqiyya, or precautionary discernment, which allowed the believer to outwardly conform to the requirements of the dominant religion while preserving the inner intent of their true faith. This practice, legitimized by legal opinions sent from scholars in North Africa who were consulted by the beleaguered community, permitted the Moriscos to attend Mass, consume forbidden foods, and adopt Christian names, provided that their hearts remained firm in their original belief. This duality created a schism in the identity of the population, a fracture between the public persona of the loyal subject and the private reality of the secret believer. The home became a clandestine mosque, where the Arabic language was whispered behind closed doors and where the traditional rites of birth, marriage, and death were performed in secret, often immediately following the official Catholic sacraments required by the state. The transmission of religious knowledge, previously the domain of the madrasas and public scholars, was forced into the oral tradition of the family, carried by the women of the household who preserved the prayers, the dietary laws, and the stories of the prophets. In the vernacular of the hearth, the repression of the Arabic language was another central pillar of the inquisitorial strategy, based on the belief that the language itself was a vessel for heresy and a barrier to true conversion. In the decades following the conversion decree, the possession of books written in Arabic became a dangerous liability, leading many families to hide their libraries in false walls known as alasinas, or to bury them in the foundations of their houses, where they would remain discovered for centuries as silent testimonies to a lost literacy. To bridge the gap between the loss of the classical tongue and the need for religious instruction, the Moriscos developed a hybrid literature known as Aljami, which consisted of the Castilian or Aragonese Romance languages, written using the Arabic script. This linguistic innovation allowed the community to maintain a connection to their sacred script while using the language of the conqueror, creating a body of clandestine texts that circulated in secret networks, containing translations of the Quran, collections of hadiths, and legal manuals adapted for the specific conditions of life under Christian rule. The existence of Aljamiado literature represents a profound act of cultural resilience, a refusal to accept the total erasure of the intellectual heritage of Al-Andalus, even as the institutions that supported it were dismantled. The impact of the Inquisition was not merely religious or cultural, but profoundly economic, as the confiscation of property from those condemned for heresy served as a significant source of revenue for the tribunal, and by extension, the crown. The fear of denunciation destabilized the commercial networks of the city, as merchants could be ruined by a single accusation, their goods seized, and their families left destitute. This predatory economic environment accelerated the decline of the traditional silk industry and the intricate craft guilds, as capital was withdrawn or hidden, and the skilled artisans who formed the backbone of the urban economy lived under the constant threat of arrest. The genealogy of blood statutes, which barred those of Jewish or Muslim descent from holding public office, attending university, or entering certain religious orders, further stratified the society, creating a permanent underclass defined by lineage rather than ability. The Morisco population, despite being legally Christian, found themselves trapped in a caste system that denied them social mobility and reinforced their isolation, driving them further into the protective, if suffocating, embrace of their own clandestine community. The first half of the 16th century in Granada was thus defined by this silent, grinding friction between a state apparatus obsessed with purity and a population adept at the arts of evasion, a stalemate of surveillance and secrecy that would persist for generations. Section 2. The Imperial Visit and the Fiscal Negotiation of Cultural Survival. In the summer of the year 1526, the dynamics of the Morisco question in Granada underwent a significant reassessment with the arrival of the Emperor Charles V, the grandson of the Catholic monarchs, who chose the city as the site for his honeymoon and a prolonged imperial residence. The presence of the emperor brought the full weight of the Habsburg court to the Alhambra, transforming the Nasrid citadel into the administrative center of a global empire that stretched from the Americas to Central Europe. This visit was not merely ceremonial. It served as an audit of the state of the integration of the kingdom, prompting a thorough investigation into the effectiveness of the evangelization efforts and the cultural assimilation of the new Christians. A committee of theologians and royal officials, known as the Congregation of the Chapel Royal, was convened to examine the grievances of the clergy, who complained that despite decades of nominal Christianity, the population remained obstinately attached to their ancestral customs, language, and dress. The findings of this committee were detailed and damning, concluding that the Moriscos were Christians in name only, and recommending a rigorous enforcement of all prohibitions against Andalusian cultural practices, including the use of the Arabic language, the wearing of traditional tunics by women, the use of henna, and the performance of the Zambra dances at weddings. The proposed restrictions presented a catastrophic threat to the Morisco community, as they aimed to strip away the remaining cultural markers that sustained their identity and social cohesion. Facing this existential crisis, the leadership of the Morisco community, composed of the wealthy merchants and landowners who still retained significant economic leverage, engaged in a high-stakes negotiation with the imperial administration. They understood that the emperor, continuously engaged in costly wars against France and the Ottoman Empire, was in perpetual need of funds to finance his military campaigns. Leveraging this fiscal necessity, they offered a massive financial contribution, a tax known as the servicio, or farda, in exchange for the suspension of the new prohibitions and the preservation of their right to wear their traditional dress and use their language. The sum offered was exorbitant, amounting to 80,000 ducats spread over several years, a figure that underscores the retained wealth of the community despite the pressures of the conquest and the Inquisition. The acceptance of this offer by Charles V revealed the pragmatic and transactional nature of the imperial policy towards the Moriscos. Ideological purity could be deferred in exchange for hard currency, creating a paradoxical situation where the state profited from the very cultural difference it claimed to abhor. This agreement, often referred to as the Concordat of 1526, effectively purchased a 40-year reprieve for the external forms of Andalusian culture, halting the immediate implementation of the repressive measures recommended by the clergy. It established a complex fiscal relationship between the Morisco elite and the crown, where the community functioned as a distinct tax base, subject to specific levies on silk production and property that were critical to the regional economy. The arrangement allowed the sound of Arabic to continue in the streets and the sight of veiled women to remain a feature of Granadan life, creating a visual and auditory continuity that masked the underlying religious tension. However, this reprieve came at the cost of increased fiscal exploitation and did nothing to address the fundamental issue of religious integration. The Inquisition continued its work on the level of individual heresy, but the broad cultural assault was temporarily suspended, allowing a generation of Moriscos to grow up in a hybrid world where they were legally Christian subjects of the emperor, yet culturally Andalusian, living in a suspended state of neither here nor there. The imperial visit also left a permanent and monumental mark on the physical landscape of the Alhambra, symbolizing the imposition of the new order upon the old. Charles V, enamored with the beauty of the location, but dissatisfied with the modest and labyrinthine nature of the Nasrid palaces, which were ill-suited to the grand protocols of the Habsburg court, ordered the construction of a new royal residence within the fortress complex. The Palace of Charles V, designed by a disciple of Michelangelo, was a massive square structure containing a circular colonnaded courtyard, built in the strict and imposing style of the Roman Renaissance. Its construction required the demolition of a section of the Nasrid palaces and created a jarring architectural juxtaposition. The heavy, rusticated stone of the imperial palace standing in stark contrast to the delicate, human-scale plasterwork and timber of the adjacent Moorish structures. This architectural intervention was a declaration of the triumph of the universal Christian empire over the local Islamic heritage, a physical manifestation of the heavy hand of the state crushing the intricate legacy of the past. The financing for this palace was drawn, with profound irony, from the very taxes paid by the Morisco population to preserve their customs. The preservation of their heritage was thus directly funding the monument to their subjugation. The construction of the palace was slow and sporadic, plagued by funding shortages and the emperor's frequent absences, leaving it unfinished for centuries, a hulking stone shell that loomed over the city as a symbol of unfulfilled ambition. Meanwhile, the administration of the city was increasingly professionalized under the corregidors and the royal chancery, which became the supreme appellate court for the entire southern half of the peninsula. These institutions worked to standardize the laws and erode the distinct legal privileges that had survived from the capitulation. The use of the Arabic language in legal documents was gradually phased out, forcing the Moriscos to rely on notaries and scribes who operated in Castilian, further alienating them from the legal process and opening avenues for fraud and dispossession. The land tenure system was also shifting, as the crown scrutinized land titles and challenged the ownership of communal lands that had traditionally been held by rural villages, leading to the enclosure of pastures and the transfer of vast tracts of the Sierra Nevada to noble families and church orders. By the middle of the 16th century, the Morisco population of Granada had become a tenant class on the land their ancestors had conquered and cultivated, bound by a web of taxes, debts, and legal restrictions, yet still holding on to the threads of their identity through the purchased silence of the state. The agreement of 1526 had bought time, but it had not bought acceptance, and the clock was ticking towards the expiration of the truce and the inevitable confrontation that would arise when the crown decided that the money was no longer worth the tolerance. The period of relative stability, purchased by the financial contributions of the Morisco community in the year 1526, proved to be a decaying asset, subject to the slow but relentless erosion of economic predation and shifting geopolitical realities as the century progressed towards its midpoint, as the administration of the Kingdom of Granada became increasingly fixated on the extraction of wealth from the productive capacities of the new Christian population. The fiscal relationship transformed from one of mutual, if unequal, benefit into one of systematic exploitation. The silk industry, which had been the economic backbone of the region for centuries and the primary source of livelihood for thousands of Morisco families, became the focal point of a struggle for control between the indigenous producers and the royal bureaucracy. The production of raw silk, nurtured by the vast plantations of mulberry trees that covered the valleys of the Alpujarras and the fertile plains of the Vega, was subjected to a stifling array of new regulations and taxes known collectively as the Renta de la Seda, which were farmed out to Genoese speculators and old Christian officials who viewed the industry solely as a mechanism for revenue generation rather than a craft to be preserved. New ordinances were promulgated that restricted the freedom of the Morisco weavers to sell their goods, mandating that all silk be inspected, stamped, and taxed at central clearinghouses, a process that introduced layers of corruption and reduced the profit margins of the artisans to the point of subsistence. Furthermore, the crown began to impose bans on the export of finished silk in favor of raw material, a mercantilist policy designed to favor the textile industries of other Castilian cities at the expense of the Granadan economy, effectively the region and forcing the Morisco population into a state of economic dependency and debt. This economic asphyxiation was compounded by a growing hysteria regarding the security of the Mediterranean coastline, which was frequently subjected to raids by the Barbary corsairs operating out of the ports of North Africa. The proximity of the Morisco population to their religious and cultural kin across the sea transformed them, in the eyes of the strategic planners in Madrid, from a reluctant subject population into a dangerous internal enemy positioned within the heart of the realm. Every raid on a coastal village, every sighting of a lateen-rigged sail on the horizon, was accompanied by rumors of collusion between the internal inhabitants and the external aggressor, leading to a tightening of the surveillance apparatus in the coastal districts. The military captaincy of Granada began to enforce strict exclusion zones, forcibly relocating Morisco communities from the immediate vicinity of the sea to the interior, a policy that severed the ancestral links between the maritime villages and their fishing grounds and further destabilized the local economy. The construction of a continuous network of watchtowers along the coast was accompanied by the systematic disarmament of the Morisco population, who were forbidden to possess even the smallest knives for agricultural or domestic use, a measure that left them defenseless against common criminals and served as a constant psychological reminder of their status as untrustworthy subjects who existed on sufferance. Simultaneously, the tribunal of the Inquisition, which had been somewhat restrained by the fiscal agreements of the earlier decades, began to reassert its authority with renewed vigor as the mid-century approached, driven by the financial imperatives of the tribunal itself, which relied on confiscations to pay the salaries of its officials and to maintain its operations. The grace period that had theoretically suspended the prosecution of certain cultural offenses began to expire in practice, if not in formal law, as inquisitors increasingly targeted the wealthy Morisco merchant families, seizing their assets upon arrest and holding them in indefinite sequestration during the lengthy and secretive trial proceedings. the distinct social contract that had allowed the Morisco elite to function as intermediaries between the crown and the community began to fracture, as even the most assimilated and loyal collaborators found that their wealth offered no protection against the accusation of crypto-Islam. The confiscation of property not only enriched the tribunal, but also facilitated the transfer of real estate and capital into the hands of the old Christian oligarchy, cementing a rigid class structure where religious lineage was the primary determinant of economic opportunity. The archives of the period reveal a litany of legal appeals and petitions filed by Morisco families attempting to reclaim seized dowries or inheritance, documents that reflected desperate reliance on a legal system that was structurally designed to dispossess them. The broader context of the Counter-Reformation, formalized by the decrees of the Council of Trent, which concluded in the early 1560s, also hardened the ideological stance of the Spanish Church, moving it away from the earlier humanist optimism of conversion through education towards a rigid insistence on doctrinal purity and cultural uniformity. The ambiguous status of the Moriscos, who lived as baptized Christians while retaining the cultural habits of Muslims, became increasingly intolerable to a hierarchy that viewed the kingdom as the bulwark of the Catholic faith against the advancing Ottoman Empire. The localized tolerance of the Granadan clergy, who had often turned a blind eye to the persistence of Andalusian customs in exchange for social peace, was replaced by a militant zealotry imported from the central seminaries, which viewed the distinct language, dress, and hygiene of the Moriscos as visible manifestations of a heretical soul. Sermons preached in the cathedral began to conflate cultural difference with treason and apostasy, preparing the psychological ground for a total rupture with the policy of gradual assimilation. The Morisco problem was no longer viewed as a matter of administrative management, but as a cancer within the body politic that required a radical surgical intervention. By the time the geopolitical tension in the Mediterranean reached its zenith with the Great Siege of Malta in the year 1565, the internal atmosphere in Granada had become toxic with suspicion and resentment, creating a volatile environment where the smallest administrative provocation could trigger a catastrophe. The crown, fearing an Ottoman landing on the Andalusian coast, supported by a general uprising of the Moriscos, began to view the entire population as a singular security threat that needed to be neutralized. The fiscal and military pressures applied to the community had failed to produce the desired assimilation. Instead, they had strengthened the internal cohesion of the Moriscos, who, stripped of their public institutions and economic power, retreated further into their private networks of solidarity and clandestine faith. The breakdown of the negotiated settlements of the past was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of grievances and betrayals, a process where the state gradually withdrew its protection while increasing its demands, leaving the subject population with no recourse but to endure the crushing weight of the bureaucracy or to contemplate the unthinkable alternative of resistance. The appointment of new, hardline officials to the key posts of the Granadan administration in the late 60s signaled that the time for negotiation had passed and that the crown was preparing to unilaterally impose a final solution to the cultural ambiguity of the South. This shift in personnel was the prelude to a definitive change in the legal framework, one that would strip away the last vestiges of the capitulations and force the population into a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Andalusian legacy. The accession of Philip II to the throne marked a definitive shift in the governance of the Spanish domains, replacing the itinerant and somewhat pragmatic imperial style of his father with a centralized, bureaucratic, and deeply pious administration that operated from the static center of Madrid. For the new monarch and his advisors, the persistence of a distinct, unassimilated population in the Kingdom of Granada was an administrative anomaly and a moral scandal that compromised the spiritual integrity of the state. In the year 1565, a provincial synod was convened by the bishops of the region to audit the spiritual health of the diocese. and its conclusions were stark and uncompromising. 6 decades of evangelization had failed. The Moriscos remained obstinate in their heresy, and the cause was identified as the continued existence of their cultural distinctiveness. The Synod recommended that the only path to true conversion lay in the total obliteration of all customs, languages, and practices that distinguished the new Christians from the old, rejecting the previous distinction between civil custom and religious rite. This theological recommendation found a willing executor in the figure of Don Pedro de, the newly appointed president of the Royal Chancery of Granada, a man of rigid legalistic mind and fervent religious conviction, who was determined to enforce the royal will without exception or delay. Working in concert with the Grand Inquisitor in Madrid, Deza and his officials drafted a new legislative instrument designed to implement the recommendations of the Synod with immediate effect. This document, known as the Pragmatica San John of 1567, was a comprehensive catalogue of prohibitions that aimed to legislate the Andalusian civilization out of existence. The decree mandated the absolute prohibition of the Arabic language in both speech and writing, ordering that all contracts and documents written in Arabic be declared null and void, and that all books in the language be surrendered within 30 days. It forbade the wearing of the almalafa and marlata, the traditional tunics and veils worn by Morisco women, requiring them to adopt Castilian dress and to unveil their faces in public. It outlawed the use of henna during weddings and celebrations, the use of Andalusian names and surnames, and the performance of traditional songs and dances, accompanied by the zambra instruments. Perhaps most intrusively, it ordered the destruction of all artificial baths, both public and private, viewing the habit of daily ablution as a crypto-Islamic ritual rather than a hygienic practice, and mandated that the doors of all Morisco houses remain open on Fridays and feast days to allow passers-by to inspect the interior for illicit rituals. The promulgation of the Pragmatica on the first day of January in the year 1567 sent a shockwave through the Morisco community, as it effectively criminalized their entire domestic and social existence. In a final, desperate attempt to avert the implementation of these draconian measures, the leadership of the community selected a representative to plead their case before the president of the Chancery. The man chosen was Francisco Nanez Muli, an elderly and respected nobleman of the Morisco elite, a Christian of long standing who had served the crown faithfully and possessed a deep knowledge of both Islamic and Castilian legal traditions. He drafted a lengthy and meticulous memorial, a document that stands today as one of the most eloquent and tragic defenses of cultural pluralism in early modern history. In his petition, Nanez Muli argued with calm logic that the customs targeted by the edict were regional traditions of the Kingdom of Granada, common to all its inhabitants, regardless of religion, and were not inherently linked to the Islamic faith. He pointed out that Christians in the Levant wore similar clothes and spoke Arabic without their faith being questioned, and he demonstrated the economic ruin that would follow the banning of the silk industry's traditional practices and the destruction of the baths. His argument was grounded in a rational distinction between culture and dogma, pleading for the right of the community to maintain its heritage, while remaining loyal subjects of the crown and faithful members of the church. He questioned the utility of forcing old women to unveil their faces or compelling a population to learn a new language by decree, suggesting that such measures would only breed resentment and hypocrisy rather than true faith. The memorial was submitted to Pedro de Deza and the High Council, who received it with cold indifference. The administrative logic of the state had moved beyond the realm of negotiation or rational debate. The decision had been made based on the imperatives of religious uniformity and security, and the nuanced arguments of Nanez Muli were dismissed as the obstinate excuses of a heretic. Deza is reported to have replied that the salvation of their souls was worth more than all the silk in Granada, and that the time for accommodation had ended. The rejection of the memorial was absolute, and the machinery of the state began to enforce the prohibitions with aggressive zeal, sending constables into the neighborhoods to tear the veils from women, close the bath, and burn the remaining Arabic texts. The failure of Nanas Muli's diplomatic intervention signaled the collapse of the collaborator class within the Morisco community, discrediting the policy of peaceful negotiation and leaving the field open to the radical elements who had long argued that survival could only be achieved through force of arms. The atmosphere in the city of Granada and the surrounding mountains during the remaining months of the year 1567 and throughout 1568 was one of ominous and suffocating silence, a calm that masked the frantic clandestine preparations for a general uprising. The deep valleys of the Alpujarras, with their inaccessible terrain and hardy rural population, became the incubator for the rebellion as secret messengers moved between the villages, stockpiling grain, forging weapons from agricultural tools, and renewing contacts with the corsairs of North Africa. The state, blinded by its own arrogance and the belief that the Moriscos were a broken and disarmed people, incapable of military action, failed to detect the magnitude of the storm that was gathering. The legal and bureaucratic structures, having exhausted their capacity for flexibility, had backed the population into a corner where their cultural identity and their physical survival were deemed incompatible with the laws of the land. The rupture was total, and as the winter of 1568 approached, the legacy of the 800-year-old civilization was about to make its final, violent stand, not in the courts or the palaces, but in the snow-covered passes of the mountains, where the authority of the chancery could not reach. The bureaucratic rupture initiated by the promulgation of the edict in the year 1567 functioned as the catalyst for the violent disintegration of the social order in the Kingdom of Granada, transforming a simmering discontent into an organized and widespread armed insurrection that would consume the region for 3 years. In the final days of the year 1568, specifically on the eve of the Nativity, the conspiracy that had been gestating in the shadows of the Albasan and the remote villages of the Alpujarras manifested in a direct military challenge to the authority of the Spanish crown. A band of armed insurgents, known as descended from the snowy heights into the capital under the cover of a blizzard, intending to incite a general uprising among the urban population by sounding the call to arms and proclaiming the restoration of the Islamic law. However, the urban Morisco population, paralyzed by the fear of immediate reprisal and the heavy presence of the royal garrison stationed at the Alhambra, remained largely behind their shuttered windows, refusing to join the initial assault, a hesitation that saved the city from immediate destruction but condemned the rebellion to the periphery. This failure to secure the capital forced the rebellion to shift its center of gravity from the urban center to the rugged, inaccessible terrain of the southern mountains, a geographical shift that would dictate the nature and duration of the conflict that followed. The rebellion was not merely a spontaneous riot, but a coordinated political act, symbolized by the election of a leader from among the old nobility, a man named Fernando de Valor, who renounced his Christian name and titles to assume the name Aben, claiming descent from the Umayyad caliphs and donning the crimson robes of royalty in a ceremony held in the remote village of Besnar. The geography of the Alpujarras, a vast and labyrinthian mountain range separating the city of Granada from the Mediterranean coast, provided the ideal theater for a protracted asymmetric war against the conventional forces of the monarchy. The terrain consisted of deep, precipitous ravines, terraced slopes cultivated with mulberry and fruit trees, and fortified villages perched on rocky outcrops, all connected by narrow, winding paths that were impassable to heavy cavalry and artillery. This landscape neutralized the technological and tactical advantages of the Spanish infantry, forcing them to engage in a grueling war of attrition where knowledge of the local topography was more valuable than the discipline of the drill square. The insurgents, utilizing their familiarity with the land, employed tactics of ambush and rapid dispersal, striking at isolated garrisons, supply convoys, and ecclesiastical targets before melting back into the snow-covered peaks. The initial phase of the uprising was characterized by a targeted violence against the symbols of the new order, specifically the parish priests and the transformation of churches back into mosques, acts that were recorded by the chroniclers of the time with meticulous and often gruesome detail. These actions were not random, but were intended to irrevocably sever the ties between the mountain communities and the Christian state, making a return to the status quo impossible and forcing the entire population to commit to the rebellion regardless of their initial reluctance. The response of the administration in Granada to this sudden explosion of violence was initially chaotic and hampered by internal jurisdictional disputes between the civil and military authorities. The Marquis of Mondayar, the Captain General of Granada, advocated for a strategy of containment and negotiation, recognizing that the rebellion was driven by genuine grievances regarding the violation of the capitulations and the fiscal extortion of the previous decades. He led a series of rapid military expeditions into the mountains in the early months of the year 1569, attempting to relieve the besieged Christian populations and to offer terms of pardon to those rebels who would lay down their arms. His reports to the king describe a conflict that was as much a civil war as a rebellion, with families divided and communities torn apart by the necessity of choosing sides. However, his policy of leniency was actively undermined by his political rivals within the chancery and the local oligarchy, led by the Marquis of Las Veles, who argued for a war of fire and blood and viewed the rebellion as an opportunity to finally crush the Morisco economic power and seize their lands. This duality of command resulted in a disjointed military effort, where promises of amnesty made by one commander were violated by the troops of another, destroying any trust the rebels might have had in the royal word and hardening their resolve to fight to the bitter end. As the spring of 1569 arrived, the rebellion spread beyond the Alpujarras to the plains of Almeria and the Serrania of Ronda, threatening to engulf the entire southern coast and raising the specter of an intervention by the Ottoman Empire. The rebels established contact with the regencies of Algiers and Tunis, receiving shipments of arms and detachments of Turkish and Berber volunteers who landed on the ungoverned beaches under the cover of darkness. The arrival of these foreign auxiliaries transformed the conflict from a local peasant uprising into a theater of the broader Mediterranean struggle between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. The royal administration, realizing the gravity of the threat, began to mobilize the militias of the Andalusian cities, calling up thousands of men from Seville, Cordoba, and Jaén to reinforce the beleaguered garrisons. These militia troops, often ill-disciplined and motivated primarily by the prospect of plunder, engaged in indiscriminate looting of Morisco villages, regardless of their loyalty, further alienating the neutral population and driving thousands of refugees into the arms of Ibn Humia. The war degenerated into a cycle of raid and counter-raid, marked by the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure, the burning of the silk harvest, and the enslavement of captured populations by both sides, transforming the prosperous valleys into a desolate wasteland of scorched earth and abandoned terraces. The internal dynamics of the rebel leadership were equally fraught with tension and instability, mirroring the chaotic nature of the war itself. Ibn Humia, attempting to build a functioning state apparatus in the midst of a guerrilla war, struggled to maintain control over the disparate bands of Manfis and the autonomous village headman, who resented central authority. His attempts to enforce discipline and to hoard the captured supplies for the war effort led to accusations of tyranny and betrayal from his own lieutenants. The social divisions that had existed in Morisco society before the war, between the urbanized nobility and the rural peasantry, re-emerged in the mountains, complicated by the presence of the North African volunteers who viewed the Andalusians with a mixture of solidarity and condescension. The fragility of the rebel command structure was exposed when Aben Humia was assassinated in his own headquarters by a faction of his rivals, an event that did not end the rebellion but rather led to the ascension of a new leader, Aban Abu, a figure of even greater intransigence and ferocity, under whose command the war entered a new and more desperate phase, characterized by a refusal to negotiate, the persistence of the rebellion into the year 1570, and the evident failure of the local commanders to suppress it, compelled King Philip II to intervene directly in the strategic management of the conflict. Recognizing that the security of the entire kingdom was at stake, he relieved the Marquis of Mondéjar of his command and appointed his own half-brother, Don John of Austria, as the supreme commander of the royal forces in Granada. This appointment signaled a fundamental shift in the nature of the war, transforming it from a provincial police action into a full-scale military campaign, utilizing the professional resources of the Spanish Empire. Don John arrived in Granada with a mandate to end the conflict decisively, bringing with him veteran Turco regiments drawn from Italy and the garrisons of Lombardy, soldiers who were disciplined, heavily armed, and experienced in the brutal art of siege warfare. The logistical machinery of the state was mobilized to support this influx of troops, with vast quantities of wheat, gunpowder, and biscuit being transported over the difficult mountain roads from the depots of Castile to the front lines in the Alpujarras. The war was no longer to be fought by ill-equipped militias seeking plunder, but by a professional army operating under a unified command structure and a strategic plan of systematic encirclement and annihilation. The arrival of professional troops also brought a shift in the rules of engagement. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant, which had already been eroding, was effectively abolished, with entire villages declared hostile territory, subject to total destruction. Before launching his main offensive into the mountains, Don John of Austria and the Royal Council made a strategic decision to secure the rear lines by removing the potential threat posed by the Morisco population still residing in the city of Granada and the surrounding Vega, although these urban Moriscos had largely refrained from joining the rebellion. They were viewed by the military planners as a fifth column that provided intelligence and supplies to the insurgents in the mountains. In a move of cold administrative efficiency, the order was given to expel the entire Morisco population of the capital to the interior of Castile, a prelude to the wider expulsions that would follow. On a designated day in June of the year 1569, the families of the Albaycin were ordered to leave their homes, locking their doors on generations of history, and were marshaled into columns to begin a forced march northward. The archives record the logistical details of this operation, the number of carts requisitioned, the guards assigned to each column, and the high mortality rate suffered by the exiles as they traversed the dusty roads of La Mancha. This deportation served its military purpose, clearing the capital of any potential internal dissent and allowing the royal army to focus its entire attention on the mountain strongholds without fear of an uprising behind their lines. It was the first act in the final tragedy of the Granadan community, a physical displacement that mirrored the cultural displacement of the previous century. With the rear secured, the royal offensive began in earnest, characterized by the systematic reduction of the rebel strongholds, one by one. The campaign was grueling, fought in the depths of winter, with soldiers battling frostbite and starvation as much as the enemy. The decisive moment of this phase of the war occurred at the siege of Galera, a fortified town in the northeast of the kingdom that had become a symbol of rebel resistance. Don John personally oversaw the siege, deploying heavy artillery and military engineers to undermine the walls of the town. The resistance was fierce, house-to-house fighting that resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. But the outcome was determined by the superior firepower and resources of the royal army. When the town finally fell, in February of the year 1570, the vengeance exacted was total. the entire male population was put to the sword, and the women and children were sold into slavery. A ruthless application of the laws of war intended to terrify the remaining insurgent pockets into submission. The destruction of Galera was followed by a scorched earth policy across the Alpejare, where the royal troops burned the harvest in the fields and cut down the olive groves, aiming to create a famine that would force the surrender of the rebels hiding in the high caves. The War of the Alpejares, as it came to be known, was a conflict of extreme brutality that devastated the demographic and economic base of the Kingdom of Granada. The silk industry, the orchards, and the complex irrigation systems that had been the envy of Europe were left in ruins. The byproduct of a strategy that prioritized political control over economic viability, the rebel leader, Abanabu, hunted like a wild animal through the caves and ravines of the Sierra Nevada, was eventually betrayed and killed by his own followers in March of the year 1571. His body brought down to Granada to be displayed as a grim trophy of the restoration of order. The death of the leader marked the military end of the rebellion, but the social and political consequences were only just beginning. The crown had won the war, but it had concluded that the coexistence of the Morisco population within the kingdom was no longer tenable. The rebellion had confirmed the deepest fears of the state regarding the unassimilability of the new Christians, and the solution that was now proposed went far beyond the repressive edicts of 1560. The military victory cleared the way for a demographic engineering project of unprecedented scale, a decision that would empty the Kingdom of Granada of its indigenous inhabitants and scatter them across the peninsula, ending the physical presence of the Andalusian civilization in the land of its birth. The silence that fell over the mountains in the spring of 1571 was the silence of a graveyard, a landscape emptied of its people, awaiting the arrival of new settlers to claim the ruins. The strategic conclusion reached by the Council of State in the aftermath of the military suppression was that the Kingdom of Granada could no longer harbor the population that had defined its character for centuries, leading to a decree of general expulsion that initiated one of the most comprehensive logistical operations of the 16th century. The decision, ratified on the first day of November in the year 1570, mandated the forced removal of virtually the entire Morisco population from the territory of the kingdom and their dispersal throughout the interior lands of Castile and western Andalusia. This was not merely a punitive measure enacted in the heat of victory, but a calculated act of demographic engineering designed to permanently sever the link between the people and the landscape, thereby neutralizing the threat of future insurrections and facilitating the complete integration of the southern frontier. The implementation of this decree required the mobilization of a vast administrative and military apparatus to escort tens of thousands of families from their ancestral homes to destinations that were hundreds of miles to the north, a journey undertaken in the depths of winter and under conditions of extreme hardship. The archives of the expulsion preserve the cold, actuarial details of this exodus, recording the number of carts requisitioned, the rations of biscuit and hard bread allocated per head, and the precise routes mandated for each column of exiles to ensure they did not converge or linger in the settled districts. The expulsion was executed in waves, beginning with the residents of the city of Granada who had already been interned or displaced, and expanding to include the rural populations of the Vega, the Valley of Lecrin, and the pacified zones of the Alpejare. The orders were specific and unforgiving. Families were given short notice to gather what movable goods they could carry on their backs or on beasts of burden, while their immovable property, houses, land, mills, and orchards was forfeited to the crown to be redistributed to new settlers. The chronicles describe long, mournful columns of humanity winding through the mountain passes and across the high plains, escorted by companies of soldiers whose primary duty was to prevent escape rather than to ensure safety. The demographic scale of the operation was immense, involving the displacement of approximately 80,000 individuals, a figure that represented a significant percentage of the total population of the kingdom. The journey was fraught with peril. The exiles were subjected to the predatory attacks of bandits and opportunistic soldiers, who stripped them of their meager savings, and they faced the hostility of the old Christian populations in the towns through which they passed, who viewed them not as refugees, but as defeated enemies and vectors of disease. The mortality rate during the march was staggeringly high, with thousands succumbing to exposure, malnutrition, and the typhus epidemics that stalked the columns. The bureaucratic records indicate a significant discrepancy between the numbers of people who departed Granada and those who were registered upon arrival in their designated places of exile, a statistical gap that represents a massive loss of life buried in the roadside ditches of La Mancha and Extremadura. The administration of the dispersal was designed to prevent the reconstitution of the Morisco community in their new homes. The exiles were broken up into small groups and assigned to specific villages and towns across the interior, where they were placed under the surveillance of the local magistrates and parish priests. They were forbidden to change their residence without permission, forbidden to live in close proximity to the coast or the Portuguese border, and subjected to a regime of registration that aimed to keep them in a state of permanent visibility and control. The social structure of the Granadan community was effectively shattered. The networks of kinship and patronage that had sustained them were dissolved by the geography of their exile, leaving individual families isolated in a foreign and often hostile cultural landscape. A distinct and particularly harsh fate was reserved for those Moriscos who had been captured during the military hostilities in the mountains, who were legally classified not as displaced subjects, but as slaves of war. The Crown, in a move to recoup the immense financial cost of the campaign, authorized the enslavement of the rebel combatants and, more controversially, their wives and children. These individuals were branded on the face to mark their status and were sold at public auctions in the markets of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, dispersed into the domestic service of the aristocracy or the labor gangs of the galleys and mines. The legal debates concerning the enslavement of baptized Christians for the rebels, or legally Christian despite their apostasy, resolved by the theologians of the court, who argued that their rebellion constituted a just war which stripped them of their rights. This enslavement of a significant portion of the population added a layer of brutality to the expulsion, tearing children from their parents and wives from their husbands, creating a legacy of trauma that would persist in the collective memory of the diaspora. The distinction between the peaceful Moriscos who were deported and the rebellious Moriscos who were enslaved often blurred in practice, as opportunistic captors ignored legal niceties in the pursuit of profit, leading 2 years of litigation by families attempting to prove their free status. The removal of the Morisco population left the Kingdom of Granada in a state of profound economic and demographic shock, creating a vacuum that the administration struggled to fill. The bustling neighborhoods of the Albaycin stood empty, the doors swinging open in the wind, the workshops of the silk weavers silent, and the terraced fields of the mountains abandoned to the encroaching scrub. The Crown had achieved its security objectives, but at the cost of destroying the most productive economy in the peninsula. The immediate aftermath of the expulsion was a period of desolation, where the royal officials, tasked with securing the forfeited property, found themselves wandering through ghost towns, cataloging empty granaries and unpruned vineyards. The state now faced the monumental task of repopulating the territory it had just depopulated, a project of internal colonization that would require decades to implement, and which would fundamentally alter the ecological and social character of the region. The expulsion of the year 1570 was the physical end of the Andalusian Granada, the final erasure of the human element that had maintained the continuity of the civilization, leaving behind only the architectural shell and the silent infrastructure of the land to await the arrival of strangers. Following the forced exodus of the indigenous population, the royal administration initiated a comprehensive bureaucratic process known as the Apeo Wairu, a cadastral survey and redistribution of the confiscated lands designed to install a new population of old Christian settlers in the vacant territories. Royal commissioners, accompanied by scribes and surveyors, were dispatched to every village and hamlet in the kingdom to create a meticulous inventory of the assets left behind by the Moriscos. These officials produced a series of massive, bound volumes, Libros de Apeo, which stand today as one of the most detailed and melancholic records of a vanished society. In these books, the commissioners recorded the dimensions of every house, the number of fruit trees in every orchard, the course of every irrigation channel, and the boundaries of every field, often noting the name of the exiled owner whose presence was now reduced to a line of ink in a ledger. The level of detail was exhaustive. They counted the mulberry trees essential for the silk industry, the olive presses, the flour mills, and the beehives, creating a paper replica of the Andalusian agricultural system, just as it began to disintegrate in the absence of its creators. The crown issued proclamations throughout the northern kingdoms of Castile, Galicia, Asturias, and Leon, offering generous terms to families willing to migrate to the south and settle the empty lands of Granada. The incentives included grants of house and land, tax exemptions for a period of years, and the promise of a new life in a climate reputed to be mild and fertile. Thousands of settlers responded to the call, motivated by land hunger, poverty, or the desire to escape the restrictive feudal structures of the north. They arrived in the Kingdom of Granada, bringing with them their own agricultural traditions, their own tools, and their own social customs, which were often ill-suited to the specialized environment of the south. The collision between the intensive, irrigation-dependent agriculture of the Andalusians and the extensive, cereal-based dry farming techniques of the northern settlers resulted in an immediate and catastrophic decline in productivity. The complex network of acequias, or irrigation canals, which required constant communal maintenance and a precise understanding of hydraulic engineering, began to fall into disrepair as the new inhabitants lacked the knowledge or the cooperative, social structures necessary to manage them. The archival records from the decades following the repopulation are filled with reports of the collapse of the silk industry, as the new settlers, unfamiliar with silk, allowed the mulberry trees to die or cut them down for firewood and timber. The delicate terraces of the Alpujarras, which held the soil in place on the steep mountain slopes, crumbled from neglect, leading to soil erosion and the loss of arable land. The settlers often found the Morisco houses, with their introverted courtyards and lack of exterior windows, to be alien and uncomfortable, leading to significant alterations, or the abandonment of traditional dwellings in favor of new constructions that mimicked the architecture of the north. The demographic density of the region plummeted, as the number of settlers willing to brave the insecurity of the frontier was far lower than the number of Moriscos who had been expelled. Many villages that had thrived for centuries were never repopulated and slowly dissolved into ruins, their names disappearing from the maps or remaining as ghostly toponyms in the landscape. The economic vitality of the kingdom, once the envy of the Mediterranean, was replaced by a subsistence economy that struggled to generate the tax revenue expected by the crown. The security of the new settlements was precarious, as the mountains remained infested with bands of Monfils insurgents who had evaded the expulsion and remained behind to wage a campaign of banditry and vengeance against the occupiers. These outlaws, operating from hidden caves and supported by the difficult terrain, descended upon the isolated farmsteads of the settlers, killing the men, kidnapping the women, and burning the crops, creating a climate of terror that discouraged further immigration. The repopulation was thus not a smooth transition, but a violent and chaotic frontier experience, where the new inhabitants lived with their weapons within reach and viewed the landscape itself with suspicion. The settlers also engaged in a frantic search for hidden treasure, believing that the exiled Moriscos had buried their gold and jewels before their departure, leading to the destruction of walls and foundations in a futile quest for the fabled wealth of the Moors. This gold fever further contributed to the degradation of the architectural heritage, as ancient structures were undermined and vandalized in the search for non-existent hoards. The social fabric of the repopulated kingdom was fundamentally different from what had preceded it. The cohesive, kin-based communities of the Andalusians were replaced by a fragmented society of strangers drawn from diverse regions, speaking different dialects, and possessing no shared history in the land. The names of the towns and geographical features were often Hispanized or changed completely in an attempt to erase the Islamic memory of the place, although the stubborn persistence of Arabic toponyms proved difficult to fully eradicate. Libres de apeo, intended as legal instruments of property transfer, ultimately served as the final testament of the Andalusian civilization, capturing the precise moment of its physical erasure. They document a landscape that was fully developed, intricately managed, and deeply humanized, a landscape that would take centuries to recover from the trauma of the substitution. The legacy of the 800 years was now entrusted to a people who did not understand it, and who viewed the remnants of the past not as a heritage to be preserved, but as the spoils of a holy war to be consumed or discarded. The transition was complete. The physical connection was broken, and the Kingdom of Granada became a standard province of the Castilian crown, its distinctiveness reduced to the romantic ruins that would eventually fascinate the travelers of a later age.
The dispersed fragments of the Granadan population, now scattered like chaff across the dusty plains of La Mancha and the urban centers of Castile, found themselves existing in a state of suspended animation, geographically severed from the landscape that had sustained their identity yet stubbornly resistant to the total cultural erasure demanded by the state. In the midst of this desolation, a singular and bizarre event occurred in the ruined capital of Granada, an event that represents perhaps the most desperate and sophisticated intellectual counter-operation in the history of the Morisco predicament. In the year 1588, workers engaged in the demolition of the Torre Turpiana, an ancient minaret that had been incorporated into the structure of the main cathedral, discovered a leaden box hidden within the masonry containing a parchment written in a mixture of Arabic, Latin, and Castilian, along with a bone relic and a painting of the Virgin. This discovery, which prophesied the end of the world and spoke of early Arab Christians in Spain, was merely the prelude to a far more extensive and elaborate revelation that would unfold 7 years later on the hill of Valparaiso, overlooking the Alhambra. There, in a series of caves that were being excavated by treasure hunters, a cache of circular lead plates was unearthed, inscribed with a cryptic script that appeared to be a primitive form of Arabic, known as Solomonic characters. These artifacts, which came to be known as the lead books of Sacrament, purported to be the Gospels and Revelations of the early disciples of St. James, specifically a St. Cecilius who was identified as an Arab, thereby establishing a foundational link between the Arabic language, the lineage of the Granada inhabitants, and the earliest, purest form of Christianity in the peninsula. The emergence of these texts generated a frenzy of religious enthusiasm in the city, transforming the hill into a site of mass pilgrimage where thousands of believers, both old and new Christians, gathered to witness the miracles attributed to the relics. For the beleaguered Morisco community, and specifically for the small circle of intellectual elites who were almost certainly the architects of this forgery, the lead books represented a theological lifeline of immense strategic value. By fabricating a history in which the first Christians of Spain were Arabs who celebrated the Mass in Arabic, they attempted to create a legitimate space for their culture within the rigid orthodoxy of the Counter-Reformation Church. If the Arabic language and the Andalusian lineage could be sanctified by these ancient apostolic texts, then the cultural prohibitions of the state would be rendered theologically invalid, and the Morisco population could claim a status of nobility and purity equal to, or even superior to, that of their Castilian oppressors. The translation of these cryptic texts was entrusted by the Archbishop to two Morisco scholars, Miguel de Luna and Alonso del Castillo, men who moved fluidly between the two worlds and who interpreted the obscure symbols with a creativity that conveniently aligned with the desperate political needs of their people. They presented the texts as proof of a syncretic monotheism that bridged the gap between Islam and Christianity, a theological compromise that sought to save the community from expulsion by rewriting the past. The Archbishop of Granada, a man desperate to elevate the prestige of his diocese, championed the authenticity of the findings with uncritical zeal, erecting a magnificent abbey on the site of the discoveries and instituting a new liturgy based on the texts. The lead books became the subject of a fierce and protracted intellectual battle that spanned decades, pitting the local believers and their Morisco translators against the skeptical scholars of the Vatican and the Supreme Council of the Inquisition in Madrid. The texts were subjected to forensic analysis by the premier linguists of the era, who pointed out the anachronisms, the philological impossibilities, and the clear Islamic doctrinal undertones hidden beneath the Christian veneer. However, the popular devotion they inspired and the political utility they offered to the local church kept the illusion alive for years, creating a strange twilight period where the very language that had been banned by royal decree was being venerated as a sacred tongue in the Hill of Sacrament. The controversy revealed the profound anxiety of a society obsessed with purity of blood and faith, yet willing to embrace a fabrication if it offered a miraculous resolution to the intractable social conflict that divided the kingdom. The ultimate condemnation of the books by the Pope would not arrive for another century, by which time the community that had created them as a shield against oblivion had long since been removed from the land. While this intellectual drama played out in the ecclesiastical courts, the reality for the vast majority of the Morisco population in the rest of Spain was one of grinding surveillance and marginalization. The exiles from Granada who had been resettled in the towns of Castile found themselves living in ghettos, subjected to a special tax regime and a system of registration that monitored their movements and employment. They were viewed with deep suspicion by the old Christian commoners, who accused them of hoarding grain, working for lower wages, and breeding at a rate that threatened to overwhelm the native population. The records of the municipal councils from this period are filled with complaints about the Morisco problem, reflecting a rising tide of xenophobia that was fueled by economic insecurity and the rhetoric of the pulpit. The assimilation that had been the stated goal of the state for a century was demonstrably failing. The Morisco communities remained endogamous, marrying only among themselves and maintaining their culinary and domestic habits despite the vigilance of the Inquisition. The failure of the parish priests to effectively catechize this population led to a hardening of attitudes within the church hierarchy, which began to view the Moriscos not as stray sheep to be shepherded, but as wolves in the fold who were impervious to grace. The geopolitical context of the late 16th century further exacerbated the precarious position of the Morisco minority, as the Spanish monarchy found itself locked in a multi-front war against the Protestant powers of the north and the Ottoman Empire in the east. In this atmosphere of siege mentality, the presence of a large, unassimilated population with perceived ties to the Islamic world was viewed as an intolerable security risk. Rumors circulated constantly of Morisco plots to aid a French invasion across the Pyrenees or to facilitate an Ottoman landing on the coast of Valencia, rumors that were often baseless but which were fed by the very real contacts between Morisco exiles and foreign courts. The discovery of correspondence between Morisco leaders and the French King Henry IV provided the hardliners in the Council of State with the evidence they needed to argue that the domestic enemy was an active agent of foreign powers. The concept of a reason of state began to supersede the theological obligation to evangelize, shifting the debate from one of religious salvation to one of national survival. The Moriscos were no longer just heretics. They were traitors, and the remedy for treason was not baptism but elimination. This shift in perspective was consolidated by the demographic anxieties of the old Christian elite, who observed with alarm the rapid population growth of the Morisco communities compared to the stagnation of the native population, which was depleted by emigration to the Americas, wars and clerical celibacy. The demographic threat became a central trope in the anti-Morisco literature of the time, painting a picture of a biological conquest that would succeed where military conquest had failed. The industriousness of the Moriscos, who were famed for their agricultural skills and their frugality, was twisted into a vice. They were accused of draining the wealth of the kingdom by hoarding silver and refusing to consume goods like wine and pork that were central to the Christian economy. This economic resentment, combined with religious hatred and security fears, created a toxic consensus that spanned all levels of society, from the destitute peasant to the grandee of the court. By the turn of the 17th century, the intellectual and political ground had been prepared for a radical solution, one that would sever the Gordian knot of the Morisco question with a single, decisive stroke. The era of debate, of attempts at assimilation, and of uneasy coexistence was drawing to a close, and the machinery of the absolute state was quietly being calibrated for an operation of ethnic cleansing that had no precedent in the history of the continent. The accession of Philip III to the throne in the year 1598 brought to power a new administration that was less burdened by the legalistic scruples of the previous reign and more inclined towards grand, theatrical gestures of piety and power. The dominant figure of this new era was the Duke of Lerma, the king's favorite and valet, who saw in the Morisco issue an opportunity to distract from the crown's bankruptcy and to burnish his own credentials as a champion of Christendom. The Council of State, under his influence, began to seriously consider proposals that had previously been dismissed as logistically impossible or morally repugnant. These proposals ranged from the forced conscription of all Morisco men into the galley fleets to the castration of male children, but ultimately settled on the option of total expulsion as the most clean and final solution. The theological justification for this act was provided by court apologists who argued that since the Moriscos were apostates who had rejected the sacrament of baptism through their heresy, the king was released from any obligation to protect them as subjects. This legal sophistry cleared the moral path for the expulsion, transforming a political necessity into a divine mandate. The decision was not made public immediately. Rather, it was held in reserve as a strategic card to be played at the most politically advantageous moment. In the interim, the pressure on the Morisco communities was ratcheted up through increased inquisitorial activity and the aggressive enforcement of sumptuary laws. The bishops of Valencia, where the Morisco population was most dense and economically vital, initially opposed the expulsion, fearing the collapse of their agricultural revenues, which were dependent on Morisco labor. However, they were eventually brought into line by promises of compensation and the argument that the spiritual purity of the kingdom outweighed any material loss. The silence of the Morisco leadership during these years is striking. Having been stripped of their nobility, their weapons, and their books, they possessed no mechanism to petition the throne or to mobilize resistance. They lived in a state of terrified anticipation, reading the signs of their doom in the hostile stares of their neighbors and the cryptic pronouncements of the friars. In the year 1609, the Truce of 12 Years was signed with the Dutch rebels, a humiliation for Spanish arms that required a compensatory victory to restore the prestige of the monarchy. The expulsion of the Moriscos was selected as this victory, a domestic crusade that would demonstrate the power of the Catholic king to purge his realms of infidelity. The order was signed on the 4th day of April in the year 1609, but it was kept a closely guarded secret while the galleys of the Royal Navy were recalled from the Mediterranean and quietly assembled in the ports of the Levant. Troops were moved into position to secure the mountain passes and the roads leading to the coast, ostensibly for training exercises or coastal defense. The secrecy was essential to prevent a general uprising and to ensure that the Moriscos would not destroy their property or hide their wealth before the blow fell. The state had learned the lessons of the Granadan War. This time there would be no chaotic struggle in the mountains, but a swift, mechanized extraction of a population that had been designated as surplus to the requirements of the nation. The announcement of the decree in Valencia in September of 1609 shattered the silence of the countryside. Town criers, accompanied by drums and trumpets, read the proclamation in the plazas, giving the Moriscos 3 days to depart from their homes and make their way to the designated ports of embarkation. They were permitted to take only what they could carry. The rest of their property, their houses, their livestock, their grain, was declared to be the property of the lords of the land. The shock was absolute. The Moriscos of Valencia, unlike their Granadan cousins, had largely remained on their ancestral lands as vassals of the Christian nobility, maintaining their language and customs in relative isolation. Now, the roots that had held them to the soil for nearly a millennium were violently torn up. The roads to the ports of Denia and Alicante became rivers of human misery, clogged with families pushing carts piled high with mattresses, cooking pots, and the elderly. The chronicles describe scenes of heart-wrenching sorrow. Men weeping as they locked their doors for the last time, women clutching their children as they faced the unknown terror of the sea, and the old Christian lords watching from their castles as their workforce and their wealth vanished over the horizon. The logistics of the expulsion were a triumph of bureaucratic organization and a humanitarian catastrophe. The Royal Navy, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, was supplemented by merchant vessels recruited from across Europe, French, English, and Genoese captains who saw a profit to be made in the transport of human cargo. The conditions on the ships were horrific. Overcrowding, lack of water, and disease turned the voyage to North Africa into a death sentence for thousands. Many were robbed and murdered by unscrupulous captains at sea. Others were attacked by Bedouin tribesmen upon landing on the shores of Oran and Tunis. The reports that filtered back to Spain of the suffering of the exiles did nothing to halt the operation. On the contrary, the efficiency of the cleansing was celebrated in Madrid with Te Deums and bullfights. The expulsion in Valencia was merely the first phase. Over the next 5 years, the decree was extended to Aragon, Catalonia, Castile, and finally to the scattered remnants of the Granadan diaspora who had thought themselves safe in their internal exile. By the year 1614, the process was largely complete. Approximately 300,000 people had been forcibly removed from the Iberian Peninsula, a demographic hemorrhage that left vast areas of the countryside depopulated and the economy in ruins. The irrigation systems of the Ebro Valley and the Huertas of Valencia fell into disrepair, banks collapsed as the loans secured by Morisco labor defaulted, and the price of food skyrocketed. But for the architects of the expulsion, these were acceptable costs for the achievement of a supreme ideological goal: a Spain that was unified, homogeneous, and purely Catholic. The problem that had begun with the fall of Granada in 1492 had been solved by the total excision of the problem population. The Andalusian civilization, which had once illuminated the world with its science, art, and tolerance, had been reduced to a memory, its physical traces repurposed by the victors, its books burned or buried, and its people scattered to the winds. The silence that descended upon the Morisco villages was the silence of finality, the quiet of a room after the clock has stopped ticking. Yet, in the very act of trying to erase them, the state ensured that their ghost would haunt the history of Spain forever, a permanent absence that defined the nation as much as any presence. The extension of the expulsion decrees to the kingdoms of Castile, Extremadura, and La Mancha in the year 1610 marked a distinct and psychologically complex phase of the demographic surgery being performed on the peninsula, differing significantly in character from the violent excision of the Valencia Moriscos. In these interior regions, the Morisco population was far more assimilated, dispersed within the urban fabric of ancient cities like Avila, Valladolid, and Toledo, where they had lived for centuries not as a separate agricultural caste but as artisans, muleteers, and small merchants woven into the daily economy of the municipalities. These communities, often referred to as the ancient Mudéjars, spoke Castilian as their mother tongue, dressed in the local fashion, and had largely abandoned the overt cultural markers that had doomed their Granadan counterparts. Their expulsion was received with a mixture of bafflement and quiet devastation, as neighbors turned upon neighbors with whom they had shared guild memberships and parish pews for generations. The administrative machinery, having refined its techniques in the chaotic ports of the Levant, operated here with a cold and relentless efficiency, issuing orders that gave families 30 days to liquidate their lives, selling their workshops, their tools, and their household goods in a market that had been artificially collapsed by the sudden glut of desperate sellers. The archives of the Castilian notaries from this year act as a grim ledger of dispossession, recording the sale of valuable vineyards for the price of a donkey, or ancestral home exchanged for a few bolts of cloth, as the exiles scrambled to convert their immovable wealth into portable assets that could be concealed from the eyes of the port officials. The exodus from the interior involved long, arduous treks across the dusty plateaus of central Spain towards the embarkation points of Seville and Cartagena, a journey undertaken in the heat of summer and the rains of autumn, monitored by royal commissioners charged with ensuring that no gold or silver bullion was smuggled out of the realm. The crown, obsessed with the retention of precious metals, enforced a draconian policy where the exiles were permitted to take only merchandise and bills of exchange, effectively confiscating the liquid capital of an entire social class at the border. The columns of Castilian Moriscos, distinguished by their Spanish dress and their fluent command of the language, presented a surreal spectacle as they marched towards the sea, a procession of people who appeared in every visible respect to be Spaniards, yet who had been legally categorized as aliens and enemies of the state. The psychological trauma of this group was acute. They were being banished to a North African homeland that was utterly foreign to them, a land whose language they did not speak, whose customs they found barbarous, and whose religion they had, in many cases, genuinely abandoned or modified into a syncretic private faith. Upon reaching the coast, they were subjected to the predatory fees of the ship captains and the bureaucratic harassment of the harbor masters, who stripped them of their last coins before herding them onto the crowded transports that would carry them across the narrow strait. The arrival of these waves of exiles on the shores of the Maghreb precipitated a complex and often hostile social collision that is frequently overlooked in the simplified narratives of religious solidarity. The Moriscos were not welcomed as returning brothers by the populations of Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis, but were viewed with deep suspicion as Christians of Castile, foreigners who dressed like the enemy, spoke the language of the enemy, and practiced a form of Islam that was considered diluted or heretical. In the ports of Morocco, the refugees were often met with violence and robbery, forcing them to band together for survival in armed caravans that fought their way into the interior. The Sultan of Morocco, while theoretically obliged to offer sanctuary, feared the destabilizing influence of this large, skilled, and desperate population, and restricted their settlement to specific zones where they could be monitored. It was in the Regency of Tunis, under the more pragmatic rule of the Ottomans, that the Andalusian diaspora found its most enduring refuge, establishing entirely new towns such as Testaur and Zaguin, which were built according to the architectural patterns of Spain, with tiled roofs, straight streets, and minarets that echoed the bell towers of Aragon. Here they reconstituted their society in exile, maintaining their Spanish language, their guilds, and their distinct identity for centuries, a fossilized fragment of the Iberian past transplanted into the soil of Africa. A distinct trajectory was followed by the most militant and maritime elements of the exiled population, particularly those from the town of Hornachos in Extremadura, who established themselves in the fortress of Sale on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. These men, hardened by years of resistance and embittered by their dispossession, declared an independent pirate republic, the Republic of Bou Rejrej, which became a scourge of Spanish shipping throughout the 17th century. Turning their knowledge of the Spanish coast and its defenses against their former tormentors, they launched relentless raids on the villages of Andalusia and the galleons returning from the Indies, exacting a brutal vengeance that was fueled by the memory of the expulsion. This pirate state, governed by a council of Spanish-speaking exiles, represents the ultimate blowback of the expulsion policy. By driving out the skilled seafarers and soldiers of the Morisco community, the Spanish crown had created a dedicated and knowledgeable enemy on its very doorstep. The archives of the Spanish Navy are filled with reports of engagements with these sail rovers, whose captains often bore Spanish surnames and who mocked their captives in the vernacular of Castile before selling them into slavery, a grim inversion of the fate that had befallen their own families. Meanwhile, back on the peninsula, the final phase of the expulsion was being enacted with a ruthless attention to the margins of the decree. The crown, realizing that thousands of Moriscos had evaded the initial order by hiding in the mountains, seeking sanctuary in monasteries, or passing themselves off as old Christians, initiated a mopping-up operation that lasted until the year 1614. This phase was characterized by a pervasive atmosphere of denunciation and manhunt, where the Inquisition and the secular courts worked in tandem to root out the stay-behinds. Special attention was paid to the children of the Moriscos. A fierce theological and legal debate had raged regarding the fate of the baptized children, with some arguing that they should be kept in Spain to be raised as Christians and others arguing that the taint of their blood was indelible. The final compromise was a tragedy of administrative kidnapping. children under the age of 7 were often forcibly separated from their departing parents and distributed among old Christian families or the church to be raised as servants and laborers, their identities erased and their names changed. This policy created a generation of orphans who grew up in the houses of the very people who had expelled their kin, living ghosts who carried the physical features of the vanished race but possessed no memory of their heritage. The completion of the expulsion in 1614 left Spain with a demographic wound that was immediately felt in the economic paralysis of vast regions. The silence that descended on the rich agricultural valleys of the Ebro and the Tagus was not merely the absence of noise, but the cessation of a specific mode of production. The intricate irrigation systems, which required constant communal maintenance and a specialized knowledge of hydraulics passed down orally through Morisco families, began to fail. The new settlers, drawn from the dry plains of the north, lacked the expertise to manage the water distribution networks, leading to the silting up of canals, the bursting of dams, and the reversion of fertile garden land to scrub and marsh. The production of sugar, cotton, and silk, which had been Morisco monopolies, collapsed almost overnight, forcing Spain to import these commodities from its rivals. The feudal lords of Valencia and Aragon, who had initially championed the expulsion to purify the faith, now found themselves facing financial ruin as their rents evaporated and their fields lay fallow. They flooded the court with petitions demanding tax relief and compensation for their losses, creating a fiscal crisis that compounded the existing bankruptcy of the state. The victory of the expulsion was revealed to be a Pyrrhic one, purchased at the cost of the structural integrity of the agrarian economy. The psychological landscape of Spain in the years immediately following the expulsion was characterized by a defensive triumphalism that masked a deep, underlying anxiety about the consequences of the act. To justify the economic pain and the human tragedy, the state engaged in a massive propaganda campaign, commissioning plays, paintings, and sermons that depicted the expulsion as a divine miracle and a heroic defense of the faith against a demonic internal enemy. The figure of the Morisco was caricatured in the literature of the Golden Age as a grotesque, treacherous, and physically repulsive subhuman, a retrospective dehumanization designed to soothe the conscience of the nation. Yet, beneath this official narrative, there existed a current of unease and doubt, expressed in the picaresque novels and the satire of the era, which often depicted the desolate countryside and the starving vagabonds that were the legacy of the purification. The ghost of the Morisco haunted the Spanish imagination, a phantom limb that continued to ache long after it had been severed. In the village squares, the silence of the absent neighbors was a constant, tangible presence, and the ruins of their houses stood as silent accusations against the ideology of intolerance. The clean Spain that had been promised was found to be a poorer, emptier, and more rigid place, trapped in a cycle of decline that the gold of the Americas could not conceal. The enforcement of the expulsion also created a lucrative black market in safe conduct passes and exemptions, revealing the corruption that rotted the heart of the administration. Wealthy Moriscos were often able to bribe royal officials to delay their departure or to secure passage to Christian lands like France or Italy instead of Africa. A significant number of the exiles managed to slip across the border into France, where they were initially allowed to settle in the southern provinces before being expelled yet again by the French crown, forcing them into a wandering existence across the face of Europe. Some found their way to the Ottoman lands of the Balkans, to Istanbul and to Salonika, where they integrated into the Sephardic Jewish communities that had been expelled from Spain a century earlier, united by a common language and a common trauma. In these distant exiles, the memory of Al-Andalus was transformed from a lived reality into a literary and nostalgic myth, a paradise lost that was preserved in the keys to the houses in Granada that many families kept as sacred relics, passing them down from father to son in the vain hope of an eventual return. The phenomenon of the tornadizos, or those who returned, became a major preoccupation for the Inquisition in the decades following 1614. Despite the penalty of death for returning to the peninsula, thousands of Moriscos, unable to adapt to the harsh conditions of North Africa or driven by a desperate longing for their homeland, managed to smuggle themselves back into Spain. They lived a subterranean existence, wandering the roads as beggars, hiding in the mountains of Granada, or blending into the anonymous underclass of the great cities like Seville and Madrid. They survived by their wits, protected by networks of old Christian neighbors who valued their labor, or by the sheer incompetence of the state surveillance apparatus. These returnees became the bandits and outlaws of popular legend, men who lived beyond the law and who waged a private war against the institutions that had dispossessed them. The Inquisition's tribunals in the 17th century were kept busy with the trials of these individuals, whose testimonies reveal a life of extraordinary hardship and resilience. They were the living remnants of the failure of the expulsion to achieve total purity, a reminder that the connection between a people and their land cannot be entirely severed by decree. As the 17th century progressed, the physical evidence of the Andalusian civilization began to undergo a slow transformation in the eyes of the Spanish observers. With the human element removed, the danger associated with the Moor began to fade, replaced by a romanticized curiosity about the ruins they had left behind. The Alhambra, the Great Mosque of Córdoba, and the Giralda of Seville ceased to be seen as active threats to the spiritual integrity of the nation and began to be viewed as antiquities, marvels of a bygone age that could be appropriated as symbols of Spanish imperial grandeur. The Moorophilia, that emerged in the literature of the mid-century, where Moorish knights were depicted as gallant and chivalrous figures in historical romances, was a direct consequence of the expulsion. It was safe to admire the Moor only because he was gone. This cultural appropriation marked the final stage of the conquest, the conversion of the enemy's history into a decorative backdrop for the victor's narrative. The legacy of 800 years was sterilized, stripped of its Islamic and resistance context, and repackaged as a glorious chapter in the history of a Spain that had successfully consumed and digested its other. The ecological impact of the expulsion on the landscape of the south was profound and long-lasting. The abandonment of the terraces in the Alpujarras and the Exarquia led to a process of desertification that is still visible today. Without the labor-intensive maintenance of the stone walls, the soil washed away in the winter rains, leaving behind bare rock and deep gullies. The diverse polyculture of the Andalusians, which combined fruit trees, vegetables, and grains in a single plot, was replaced by the monoculture of wheat and vine preferred by the settlers, reducing the biodiversity of the region and making the harvest more vulnerable to pests and drought. The silence of the land was thus also an ecological silence, the loss of a specific biological complexity that had been engineered over centuries. The forests of mulberry trees, once the engine of the silk economy, were cut down, and the sound of the loom, which had characterized the villages of Granada, was replaced by the silence of rural poverty. The landscape itself bore the scars of the political decision, a physical testament to the fact that a civilization is not just a collection of buildings and books, but a living relationship between people and their environment. By the middle of the 17th century, the demographic recovery of the expelled regions was still incomplete. The ghost towns of the interior remained largely empty, their houses used as quarries for building materials by the few remaining inhabitants. The royal commissioners eventually stopped trying to recruit settlers, acknowledging that the land had lost its value. The Morisco geography of Spain became a geography of ruins and depopulation, a stark contrast to the demographic boom that was occurring in northern Europe. The decline of Spain as a great power, often attributed to imperial overstretch and inflation, was fundamentally rooted in this self-inflicted wound, the excision of its most productive and industrious class. The legacy of the expulsion was a nation that was spiritually unified but materially impoverished, a giant with feet of clay standing amidst the ruins of its own making. The finality of 1614 was thus the beginning of a long, slow decline, a silence that settled over the peninsula and which would not be broken until the modernization of the 19th century began to rediscover the buried strata of the past. The establishment of the Andalusian diaspora on the southern shores of the Mediterranean represented not merely a demographic transfer but the transplantation of a distinct and fully formed early modern European culture into the context of the Maghreb, creating a unique sociological phenomenon that would persist for centuries. In the Regency of Tunis, under the pragmatic governance of the Ottoman days, the influx of 80,000 refugees was viewed not as a burden but as a providential opportunity to revitalize the agricultural and industrial base of the state, which had been depleted by plague and famine. The Ottoman authorities, recognizing the technical skills of the exiles in irrigation, construction, and hydrology, granted them land and a significant degree of autonomy, allowing them to elect their own leaders, known as the Sheikh el-Andalus, and to administer their own internal affairs according to the customs they had brought from Aragon and Castile. It was here, in the fertile valley of the Majorda River, that the exiles engaged in a remarkable act of architectural and cultural mimicry, building entirely new towns such as Testaur, Tiburba, and Solomon that were physical replicas of the Spanish villages they had left behind. These settlements were characterized by wide, straight streets intersecting at right angles, a town square or plaza dominated by a religious building, and houses covered with pitched roofs of red terracotta tiles, a construction technique that was alien to the flat-roofed architectural tradition of indigenous North Africa. The minarets of the mosques constructed in these towns were frequently built in the style of Aragonese bell towers, employing brickwork and decorative motifs that echoed the Mujar churches of the Ebro Valley, a visual testament to the hybrid identity of a people who had lived for generations on the frontier between two faiths. Within the walls of these new settlements, the community maintained a stubborn and melancholic adherence to the cultural markers of their lost homeland, refusing to dissolve into the surrounding Arab population. The Spanish language, specifically the Castilian and Catalan dialects, remained the language of commerce, family life, and even religious instruction for nearly a century after the expulsion. Notarial records from the 17th century in Tunis show business contracts and marriage deeds written in Spanish using the Arabic script, or aljamiado, preserving the legal formulas and social etiquette of the Iberian Peninsula. The women of the Andalusian community were noted by travelers for their distinct dress, which did not include the face veil common to local women, and for their social freedom, a trait that was often viewed with suspicion by the conservative religious scholars of Tunis. This distinctiveness was not merely a matter of habit but a conscious strategy of preservation. To be Andalusian was to belong to an aristocracy of suffering and civilization, a status that separated the exile from the Bedouin or the local city dweller. They preserved their Spanish surnames, identifying themselves as Blanco, Perez, or Jimenez, even as they adopted Islamic first names, creating a genealogical dissonance that served as a permanent reminder of their origins. The agricultural transformation of northern Tunisia by these exiles was profound, mirroring the impact their ancestors had once made on the Iberian landscape. They repaired the ancient Roman aqueducts that had fallen into ruin, introduced the intensive cultivation of market gardens, and expanded the production of olives and vines using the grafting techniques they had perfected in Granada and Valencia. The landscape of the Majorda Valley was reshaped into a reflection of the huertas of Valencia, a patchwork of intensively irrigated plots that produced a surplus of food for the markets of Tunis. This economic success granted the Andalusian community a privileged position within the Tunisian state, allowing them to rise to high office in the military and the administration, where they often served as diplomats and translators in dealings with the European powers. Yet, this material success was always underlined by a pervasive sense of transience and loss. The Malouf musical tradition of Tunisia, which traces its origins directly to the refugees of Seville and Granada, preserved the poetic and melodic structures of medieval Andalusia, serving as a repository of collective memory where the sorrow of exile was sublimated into art. The lyrics of these songs, passed down orally through generations, spoke of the beauty of the lost cities, the scent of the orange blossoms in Córdoba, and the bitterness of the sea passage, keeping the wound of the expulsion open in the cultural imagination long after the last survivor of the crossing had died. However, the passage of time and the inevitable pressures of the environment slowly eroded this distinct identity. By the 18th century, the use of the Spanish language began to fade, surviving only in isolated pockets and in the domestic vocabulary of the kitchen and the workshop. The distinct architectural style of the Andalusian towns began to merge with local forms, as the red tiles were replaced by flat roofs and the wide streets were encroached upon by new construction. The Tagarins, from Aragon, and the Granadinos, from the south, who had initially maintained separate communities and even separate mosques due to their linguistic differences, gradually fused into a single social entity. The keys to the houses in Spain, which had been kept as sacred relics in leather pouches and hung on the walls of the exile homes, became symbolic artifacts rather than practical tools of return. They were passed down to grandchildren who had never seen the shores of Spain, becoming mythic objects representing a paradise lost that grew more abstract with each generation. The Andalusian identity transformed from a lived reality into a marker of social prestige, a claim to a refined lineage that distinguished a family from the common mass, but which no longer signified a meaningful cultural difference in daily life. The civilization of Al-Andalus had not died in 1492 or 1609. Rather, it had slowly dissolved like sugar in water, sweetening the culture of the Maghreb while losing its own distinct form. Back across the sea, in the empty and silent kingdom of Granada, the physical legacy of the 800 years entered a long period of dormancy and decay, interpreted by the Spanish state through the lens of neglect and utility rather than historical reverence. The Alhambra, once the jewel of the Nasrid dynasty and the administrative center of the Habsburg Emperor, was largely abandoned by the Bourbon dynasty that took the Spanish throne in the 18th century. The royal subsidies for its maintenance were cut, the roofs began to leak, and the intricate plasterwork, exposed to the elements, began to crumble into dust. The palaces became a haven for the marginalized population of the city, squatters, gypsies and invalid soldiers, who set up their looms and cooking fires in the courtyards of the caliphs. The distinct tile work was stripped from the walls to be sold to tourists or used in local construction, and the wooden ceilings were broken up for firewood during harsh winters. The sublime decay of the monument during this period was not a romantic affectation but a grim reality of poverty and administrative indifference. The complex hydraulic system that supplied water to the Generalife gardens became clogged, the fountains ran dry, and the meticulously planned vegetation grew wild, turning the ordered paradise of the sultans into a tangled wilderness of brambles and weeds. This neglect, however, was accompanied by a subtle shift in the intellectual appreciation of the Moorish past among the enlightened elite of the Spanish academies. As the hysteria of the Counter-Reformation faded and was replaced by the rationalist curiosity of the Enlightenment, the physical remains of the Andalusian civilization ceased to be viewed solely as the detritus of a heretical enemy and began to be reassessed as antiquities worthy of study. In the mid-18th century, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid commissioned a project to survey and draw the Arabian antiquities of Granada and Córdoba. This initiative marked a fundamental turning point. For the first time, the state was deploying draftsmen and architects to document the Islamic heritage, not to destroy it or to convert it, but to record it as a valid chapter in the history of architecture. These drawings, produced with mathematical precision, stripped the buildings of their later Christian accretions in the imagination, presenting them in their pure form and revealing the geometric sophistication of their design to a European audience that was beginning to tire of the heavy Baroque style. The inscriptions on the walls, previously ignored or viewed with superstitious dread, were copied and translated by a new generation of Arabist scholars who sought to reconstruct the history of the Nasrid dynasty from primary sources. This academic appropriation was the first step in the rehabilitation of the Andalusian legacy, transforming the Moor from a theological threat into a historical subject, safe to be studied because he was safely dead. The real transformation in the status of the Granadan legacy, however, arrived with the violence of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent Romantic invasion of the 19th century. The French occupation of Granada in the year 1812 was a paradoxical event. The French troops, while looting the city and converting the Alhambra into a military barracks and ammunition dump, also possessed a secular appreciation for the artistic value of the monuments. The French commanders undertook some of the first rudimentary repairs to the structures, clearing away the squatter settlements and reinforcing the foundations, even as they prepared to blow up the entire complex upon their retreat. It was only the disobedience of a Spanish corporal, who severed the fuses of the explosives left by the departing French army, that saved the Nasrid palaces from total annihilation, a moment where the legacy hung by a literal thread. The aftermath of the war left the Alhambra a smoking, battered ruin, but it also opened the gates of Spain to a new kind of invader, the Northern European traveler, the writer and the artist, armed not with swords but with sketchbooks and a thirst for the Oriental picturesque. For the romantic imagination of the 19th century, weary of the industrialization and rationality of the North, the ruins of Granada offered a perfect canvas for their fantasies of exoticism, passion, and decay. Writers from America, England, and France flocked to the city, taking up residence in the empty chambers of the palaces, sleeping wrapped in cloaks on the marble floors, and listening to the sound of the nightingales in the overgrown gardens. They wrote best-selling tales that repopulate the empty halls with ghosts, sultanas, and tragic lovers, creating a literary mythology that often had little to do with historical reality but which proved immensely powerful in shaping the global perception of the site. This orientalizing gaze reconstructed Granada not as a Spanish city, but as a gateway to the East, a suspended fragment of the Arabian Nights stranded in Europe. The popularity of these writings shamed the Spanish state into action. Realizing that they possessed a cultural asset of global significance, the government declared the Alhambra a national monument in the year 1870. This declaration marked the official end of the era of neglect and the beginning of the era of restoration, a process that would prove to be almost as destructive as the decay itself. The restoration efforts led by a dynasty of architects in the late 19th century were driven by a desire to return the monument to an idealized state of perfection that had perhaps never existed. Guided by the romantic taste of the era, they reconstructed collapsed walls, repainted faded stucco in garish colors, and fabricated Moorish details where none remained, creating a scenographic version of the past designed to satisfy the expectations of the tourist rather than the rigor of the historian. The Oriental style became a fashion in Spanish architecture, appearing in bullrings, train stations, and casinos, a kitsch echo of the great civilization that had been legislated out of existence 3 centuries earlier. The physical legacy of Al-Andalus was thus saved by being transformed into a commodity, a sanitized and exotic backdrop for the modern nation-state. The deep, traumatic history of the conquest, the coerced conversions, the Inquisition, and the expulsion was carefully smoothed over, replaced by a harmless narrative of cultural coexistence and romantic loss that acknowledged the beauty of the stones while remaining silent about the fate of the people who had hewn them. The legacy of the 800 years had finally been assimilated, not by blood, but by the museum, enclosed within velvet ropes and explained by guidebooks, a beautiful, silent captive in the land of its birth. The transition from the romantic mythologizing of the 19th century, which viewed the Andalusian past through the distorted lens of exoticism and literary fantasy, to the forensic scrutiny of the 20th and 21st centuries marked a profound shift in the understanding of the extinguished civilization, moving the narrative from the realm of legend to the cold, empirical reality of the laboratory and the excavation trench. Modern archaeology, stripped of nationalistic bias and armed with the precise tools of stratigraphy and carbon dating, began to peel back the layers of the Spanish soil to reveal a history that was far more complex, resilient, and intertwined than the official chronicles of the expulsion had ever admitted. In the rural hinterlands of Valencia, Murcia, and Extremadura, where the written record claimed a total demographic replacement, the spade of the archaeologist unearthed a different truth hidden beneath the foundations of parish churches and in the abandoned terraces of the mountains. Excavations of medieval cemeteries or maqbaras, discovered during the expansion of modern urban infrastructure, revealed thousands of remains interred according to the Islamic rite, bodies lying on their right side, facing towards the southeast, dating to periods long after the official conversions and edicts of expulsion. These silent fields of the dead, hidden under public squares and parking lots, provided irrefutable physical evidence that a significant portion of the population had maintained their distinct burial customs in secret, or that the local authorities had tacitly permitted these practices to continue well into the era of the Inquisition, suggesting a lived reality of coexistence that defied the binary logic of the state decrees. The examination of domestic architecture in the rural villages of Andalusia and La Mancha further dismantled the narrative of a total cultural rupture. Architectural historians, analyzing the construction techniques of humble farmhouses and granaries, identified the persistence of distinctively Andalusian building methods, the use of rammed earth, the specific organization of the interior courtyard, and the orientation of the structure to maximize shade and water collection. that continued to be employed by Christian builders for centuries after the conquest. This structural continuity implied that the transmission of technical knowledge had not been severed by the expulsion of the master builders. Rather, the old Christian settlers had absorbed and adopted the superior adaptation of the indigenous population to the harsh climate of the south. The physical landscape of Spain was thus revealed to be a palimpsest, where the grid of the modern village often sat directly upon the irregular street plan of the Alqueria, and where the church tower was frequently a repurposed minaret, its Islamic origins disguised but not erased by a Baroque belfry. The water courts of the Mediterranean coast, institutions that adjudicated disputes over irrigation rights, continued to operate according to oral rules and meeting schedules established in the 10th century, a functional survival of the Andalusian legal framework that had outlived the kingdom that created it by half a millennium. However, the most significant and disruptive revision of the historical record arrived with the advent of genetic analysis in the 21st century, which provided a biological archive that the inquisitors could not burn and the scribes could not falsify. Large-scale studies of the genetic makeup of the modern Iberian population conducted by international teams of researchers revealed a startling and statistically significant persistence of North African genetic markers across the peninsula. Contrary to the historical expectation that the highest concentration of these markers would be found in Granada, the last bastion of Islamic rule, the data showed the highest frequencies in the west. In Galicia, Leon, and Extremadura, the very regions where the Granadan refugees had been dispersed after the War of the Alpujarras and before the final expulsion. This genetic map suggested a historical reality that radically contradicted the official narrative of a clean expulsion. It implied that a substantial percentage of the Morisco population, perhaps as many as 40% in some areas, had managed to evade the decree of 1609. They had done so by blending into the local population, changing their names, moving to neighboring villages where they were not known, or protected by local lords and bishops who valued their labor more than the purity of the state. The blood of Al-Andalus had not been drained from the peninsula. It had been absorbed, diluted, and rendered invisible, flowing in the veins of the very population that had defined itself for centuries by its opposition to the Moor. This biological persistence was mirrored by a linguistic and cultural residue that permeated the daily life of Spain, often unrecognized by those who practiced it. Philologists catalogued thousands of words of Arabic origin in the Spanish lexicon, words related not only to war and administration but to the most intimate aspects of domestic life: the construction of a house, the cultivation of a garden, the cooking of food, and the expression of affection. The culinary traditions of the South, with their heavy reliance on almonds, saffron, honey, and the frying of fish in oil, were direct continuations of the Andalusian diet, preserved in the kitchens of Christian grandmothers who had forgotten the origins of the recipes they prepared. The distinct musical structures of flamenco, originating in the marginalized communities of Lower Andalusia where Moriscos, Gypsies, and poor Christians lived in close proximity, preserved the microtonal scales and the emotional intensity of the Andalusian nuba, transforming the sorrow of the expulsion into the defining sound of the Spanish soul. The legacy of the 800 years was thus proved to be not a closed chapter or a foreign occupation, but the foundational stratum of modern Spanish identity, a ghost that could not be exorcised because it was part of the body itself. As the narrative of the singular, monolithic Spanish identity began to fray under the weight of this evidence, the modern state began to engage in a complex and often contradictory process of political reconciliation with its Islamic past. The Democratic Constitution of 1978 dismantled the national Catholic ideology that had governed the country for decades, opening the door for a re-evaluation of the Reconquista narrative. Regional governments in Andalusia began to actively promote the Islamic heritage as a marker of regional distinctiveness, restoring fortresses, baths, and palaces that had been neglected for centuries. The route of the Caliphate became a tourist itinerary, and the image of the Moor was transformed from a national enemy into a symbol of a golden age of tolerance and scientific achievement. This rebranding, however, was often superficial and commercial, driven by the needs of the tourism industry rather than a genuine societal introspection. The celebration of the three cultures, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, became a diplomatic tool for relations with the Arab world, a soft power asset that glossed over the violence of the erasure. Yet, the legal recognition of this past remained uneven. While the Spanish state offered a fast track to citizenship for the descendants of the expelled Sephardic Jews in the year 2015, recognizing the historic injustice of 1492, no such offer was extended to the descendants of the Moriscos, reflecting the enduring political sensitivity of the Islamic question and the security anxieties that had persisted for 500 years. The global diaspora of the Andalusian civilization, meanwhile, had largely faded into the cultural tapestry of the Maghreb and the Mediterranean, losing its distinctiveness as a separate community while imparting a permanent flavor to the societies that had hosted it. In Tunisia and Morocco, the families that claimed Andalusian descent still held on to the prestige of their lineage, but the Spanish language had long since vanished from their tongues, replaced by Arabic and French. The keys to the houses in Granada, once the tangible promise of return, had rusted away or been lost, and the deeds to the lands in the Vega had crumbled into dust. The specific grief of the exile had been metabolized into a general melancholic aesthetic, visible in the architecture of the mosques of Testaur and the palaces of Rabat, and audible in the orchestras of the Maloof. The Andalusian identity in North Africa had become a cultural style rather than a political claim, a memory of refinement and urbanity that stood in contrast to the rural traditions of the interior. Yet, the connection remained. When modern Spanish tourists walked the streets of the Medinas in Fez or Tunis, they were often struck by the uncanny familiarity of the faces, the food, and the architecture, a recognition of a shared reflection in the mirror of the Mediterranean. However, the most unexpected and far-reaching legacy of the fallen civilization was to be found not in Africa or Europe, but across the Atlantic Ocean, in the vast territories of the Spanish Americas. The conquest of the New World occurred simultaneously with the fall of Granada and the suppression of the Moriscos, and the ships that sailed for Mexico and Peru carried with them the architectural and artistic vocabulary of Andalusia. The Spanish colonial style that defines the historic centers of Mexico City, Lima, and Havana is, in its structural DNA, a mudéjar style. The enclosed courtyards with their central fountains, the wooden latticework balconies that screen the women from the street, the polychrome tiles that cover the domes of the churches, and the elaborate wooden ceilings of the cathedrals are all direct transplants of the Granadan aesthetic. The craftsmen who built the new cities of the empire included thousands of new Christians seeking to escape the stifling atmosphere of the peninsula, bringing with them the skills of the Alarife and the tile maker. In the missions of California and the haciendas of the Andes, the ghost of the Alhambra found a new life, replicated in adobe and stone on a scale that the Nazarites could never have imagined. The legacy of Al-Andalus thus bypassed the censorship of the Inquisition to become the foundational aesthetic of a hemisphere, proving that while a state can be destroyed, a civilization is a viral idea that adapts and mutates in new environments. Ultimately, the story of the fall of Granada and the end of Al-Andalus is a testament to the fragility of political structures and the endurance of cultural forms. The 800 years of Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula were not a parenthesis in European history, but a constitutive period that shaped the identity of the West. The translation movement in Toledo, which transmitted the Greek philosophy and Arab science of Córdoba to the universities of Paris and Oxford, laid the intellectual foundations for the Renaissance. The agricultural revolution of the Andalusians changed the diet of the Mediterranean forever. The poetry of the courts of Seville and Granada introduced the concept of courtly love that would define European literature. The civilization ended in fire and silence, its books burned in the square of Bibrambla and its people scattered to the winds, but its echo is ubiquitous, present in the guitar strummed in a tavern in Seville, in the tiles of a church in Mexico, and in the genetic code of the people who walk the streets of modern Madrid. The Reconquista succeeded in conquering the land, but it failed to conquer the past. As the sun sets over the modern city of Granada, the Alhambra still stands on its red hill, no longer a fortress of a threatened dynasty but a silent witness to the passage of time. The tourists who crowd its halls speak a dozen languages, heirs to the globalized world that began in 1492. The call to prayer is no longer heard from the Torre de la Vela, but the silence of the monument is not empty. It is a heavy, resonant silence that holds the memory of the poets, the scientists, the sultans, and the exiles who once called this place home. The water still flows in the channels of the general life, following the gravity decreed by the engineers of the 13th century, indifferent to the flags that have changed overhead. The story of Al-Andalus is a tragedy of loss, but it is also a story of survival, a reminder that civilizations do not truly die as long as their traces remain in the stones, the words, and the blood of those who come after. The legacy is a phantom limb, an invisible part of the body that still feels the sensation of life, a persistent ache that reminds the present of what was lost to create it. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.